people see fewer options than there actually are. I think the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater a lot. And what I mean by that is that people will look at PT and go, well, it's either, you know, go to this insurance-based clinic where they're not going to view me as an athlete, or I go to this cash pay clinic where I don't know that I can afford to go consistently. And when you're left with only those two options, I agree. I think going to see someone who's out, you know, outside of the insurance network, there's a lot more freedom and flexibility with that. I think the bigger component to that is generally those people are personality wise, they're less risk averse. And so they're more, it's kind of like people who go out into the world and learn and like really experience rather than sit back and wait for stuff. Right. So I think in general, those are probably better clinicians, not only from you're going to get better care because you're not with insurance, but I think those are generally more forward thinking people.
Sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, my guest is Dani LaMartina.
LaMartina.
LaMartina?
Yeah.
I don't want to say what the old name was.
Oh, you can.
Over cash.
Yeah, I had the coolest last name in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, like when I married Dave, I told him it is a sign of true love when I actually take his last name instead of my former last name over cash, like the nicknames and all that I had growing up always.
It took me like 2 years, you know,
to make the switch.
To make the switch. It really did.
That's okay.
Because I'm like, oh, man. All right, so, I mean, a real quick summary. You know, I think this is the second or third time you've been on the podcast. The last time you were out here was January 2022. And a few things I just want to point out for people that haven't heard you or listened to you before. You're a former all-time world record breaker in powerlifting, IFBB pro, a doctor of physical therapy, and a coach. Did I forget anything?
Olympian.
An Olympian, yes.
But I did not. I need to correct that. I don't know where the record came from. I definitely have never broken a record.
Okay.
Not world. I think my best at one point was I was top 10 all time, which, I mean, it's still pretty good, but
that might be that's because when I did question that one because I was kind of like a GPT that threw up in there. And then it was for the bench. And I'm like, oh, I don't know.
No.
You know, it's
no, I mean, I've got
anything, it would be the deadlift.
Yeah, I've got some good numbers. Like, I think I'm a pretty complete power lifter. Like, I don't have one bad lift or one, well, my deadlift is probably strong, but it's not like it still outpaces the others that, you know. So. All
right. One thing I want to put out there before we get into this is if you guys want to support the podcast, we have the crew, which the link is in the description to be able to join the crew. When you're a member of the crew, you get access to our webinars, ebooks, discount codes, and actually there's a discount code for any listener, which is Table Talk 10. And what I want to point out with the crew is if you don't want to be a member of the crew, we started loading the ebooks and the webinars to the site. But I think you're going to quickly realize when the courses are $100 and the crew is $20, and you get access to that if you join the crew just over a period of a month with the one ebook. And the last one we just put out was on dynamic effort training. That was my content. And then Tom did the webinar on I should know this because I just loaded that.
I think it was the diaphragmatic breathing and core training.
The core training. So just those two alone have a value of $150, where $20 for the crew is kind of like a no-brainer. So link in the description. It helps support the show. We also have limited edition apparel, which I'm wearing one of the new ones now, which was Tom's idea, so I got to give credit. Because I had, you know, an AC/DC shirt, and he said, well, why not go, actually, this is AC/DC.
You swapped it out. You got the wrong one on, man.
Anyhow, I got the wrong one on. So forget all that. But I have one that says MEDE conjugate elite FTX.
Love it.
Yeah. So that shows you where my brain was this morning when I got up. Anyhow, where we're going to start.
Oh, can I jump in really quickly?
Yeah.
So just as someone that's been part of the Team Elite FTS Discord for a while, what you guys do within the Discord for the crew and for people who have attended the Train Your Ass Off and things like that, the value that goes into there and the interaction that is in there, I think is so understated. So if you're considering it, really, I can't urge you strong enough. Like every now and then I get in Discord and I can't keep up with the messages because there's so much good stuff coming out.
Well, the community is awesome, and the forum checks as well.
Yeah.
You know, and the crazy thing is, out of all the members, 80% of them actually never log into Discord. They just get, because if
so that's only 20% that's in there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So if they're a crew member, they get 1 or 2 emails per month, and that's the extra podcast episode, that's the webinar, and that's the ebook. So they still get all this extra content.
Okay, cool.
But don't go that extra step for that. And maybe it's because Discord is, people don't want another social media, you know.
Yeah.
But it's really not. It's kind of like an old school forum. It's very easy to navigate, but you're right. There's a lot that goes on in there. I mean, Tom and Seth and some of these people are just crazy. And there's AMAs every week and stuff like that. So there's a lot. So there's, value wise, it's way more than what I'm kind of giving it credit for.
Absolutely. That's kind of what I wanted to point out to people, is like, there's a ton in there.
Yeah. So dad jokes.
Do you want one I made up, or do you want a really good one?
I want one you made up. Because
shoot.
Yeah, because that's going to be.
All right. What is Snoop Dogg's favorite kind of bread?
Snoop Dogg's favorite kind of bread. I don't know.
Holla!
Oh, God.
I think that might be the biggest eye roll that's happened on a table talk.
Yeah.
Did I just win that?
Yes, you did.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Now give me one that you didn't make up.
I mean, what, was mine not good enough?
No, that was good enough, right? But we can feed these in throughout the whole podcast. So those people that don't care about what we're going to talk about, but just want dad jokes.
They're just here for the dad jokes. So, why do this one's courtesy of my husband, going to give him a shout out. He's stockpiling these. Why do all the ships in the Norwegian Navy have barcodes? Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
So when they return the port, they can Scandinavian.
Oh, God.
So I started these dad jokes because, you know, you get on Instagram and especially in the bodybuilding community, a lot of the women take, you know, we do photo shoots and things like that. And there's always some like, you know, Fitspo quote in there, you know, live, laugh, love, or like dig deeper today than yesterday. I'm like, yeah, cool. I just figured I'd start throwing dad jokes in mine.
Yeah. So they're on your Instagram then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I need to spend more time on
No,
Instagram.
you don't. There's really not.
No, I do, because that's the kind of stuff I want to see. Like, I don't want to see all the crap that I see most of the time that I go on there.
I don't either.
You know, to where that would be good. It's like, sometimes I try to hack my feed. Yeah. So it's just the things that I want. Mm-hmm. It never lasts very long.
No, it doesn't.
You know, it always defaults back to some other crap that I don't want to see.
I have within my client community, we have a running thread of dad jokes now. It's great.
How many do you think there are?
They're probably, it's not huge. It's like 11 or 12. But the best thing about it is it started because someone else started it. I didn't even start it. It was just kind of like this running theme that happened that I tend to work with a lot of people who don't take life too seriously. Mm-hmm. And I feel like if you can't enjoy a dad joke, there's something wrong.
So what have you been up to since the last time you were out here, January 2022?
A lot for some phases and nothing in other phases.
Okay, so let's go with the phases that there's a lot.
So 22, I was out here with Justin and we did the table talk. We were getting ready to launch Change Proponent in a couple months. Yeah. And I was getting ready for my pro debut. It was right before, probably about a month before I started prep for my pro debut at Chicago 2022. And that year was a lot. I mean, we had my pro debut and then I spoke at Swiss that fall. And both of those things, when you look at it from the outside, you're like, man, like those are really, really big wins. But neither one of them really went the way that, I don't want to say they didn't go the way that I wanted them to go. It was more like they went in a direction that really made me doubt whether or not I had a place in either one of those settings, either as an educator or as a, on the pro stage.
How so? Let's go with Swiss first.
So Swiss, I mean, I tried to cram a lot into too short of a time.
Well, that's just experience though.
Yes, it is. And I think that, for that setting, I felt like I had to really prove myself. Mm-hmm. I've written for Elite FTS for a while and I don't do a lot of social media and things like that. And so I felt like I came in and this was like this huge opportunity, and I felt like I bombed it. It was one of those times where I had someone kind of helping me walk through, like, no, like, you have a lot of really good stuff. You're going to be a home run. And
now, when you say prove yourself, to whom?
Ultimately, now, you and I both know the answer to this.
I know, but what was it then?
At that point, I thought I needed to prove myself externally. I felt like I needed to prove myself that I could hang with some of these bigger names, that I have something to offer, that I deserve a seat at the table with them, things like that. And that's exactly how I felt getting on stage in 22.
Well, I think that's important to talk about, because everybody goes through that, even if they just say that they don't, especially with the presentations, is you can see it. Like, are you presenting for the people that are actually attending, or are you presenting to be able to look good to your peers, the other presenters, which many times they're not even in the room, which has always been the one thing that was, interesting when I was going through all that, and I figured it out, that what am I doing? They're not even, like, two people are here. Yeah. Like, one's Serrano and he's only here to bust my balls. Yeah. So. And
need that.
Yeah. So did you feel that same type of way when you got on the pro stage?
I think with both, again, with the, yes.
Well, yes. I mean, imposter syndrome, something that I've never really understood how that really is defined and what that really is. But I can see what we're talking about, which may be that,
I think there's kind of an X factor, right? Like, when someone shows up, how they show up, like how they enter a room, there's kind of that intangible. And I think that perceptive people like you can probably pick up on that right away, and how their presentation's going to go. And I would bet that a good chunk of the time you're correct. And when you're incorrect, you're like, oh, I'm going to go talk to that person. I think for Swiss, because I was coming off of a disappointing bodybuilding season, and I can talk about again why. It's not that I was upset about the outcome. Again, like what Justin and I brought to a pro debut stage, and my opinion was like, I thought we brought a great look. But because I was coming off of what I perceived as a loss of something that I had control over, which was how I showed up, I think I was so hyper focused on it for Swiss. I was like, I got to show up as someone that, like, looks like she knows what she's talking about. And like, I was just trying to prove to myself that there is inherent value in just being present. And that's something that, I'm going through a lot of things right now that are making me peel back the layers of why that is. And it goes way far back and it's super deep. And in hindsight, hindsight's always 20/20, right? I think that for bodybuilding, what was so frustrating for me about that season wasn't necessarily placing. Again, like, I didn't really expect much. I was undersized. I knew that coming in. I knew that I did the work to bring conditioning, which was the thing I had a lot of control over. And, I followed Justin's plan to a T, and I trusted him. Where I felt like I failed myself. I got on stage and I don't know what happened, but it was like I'd never posed before. And granted, it was only my third time on stage. I turned pro very quickly. I basically hit a local show. I hit a pro qualifier and turned pro. And I was like, Chicago Pro was the next year. So a lot of that, again, comes down to the very same issue that was present at Swiss, which was practice time. And I think you kind of have to go through that failure in a way to recognize that it really is okay. And it's something that we hear all the time. I can't tell how many people have told me, like, you're going to fail and it's going to be okay. But as someone who's generally failure averse, again, for a lot of very deep-seated reasons, I did have to experience that. I had to have my house of cards kind of knocked over. And then I rebuilt it again a little bit last year and then had it knocked over again. And I think that that's a process of people, is kind of reinventing ourselves to always be something that is new.
So what were the changes that led into the show that you won?
So Chicago Pro 2023, I hadn't planned on doing that show. My husband and I are kind of at this point where it's like, do we want to have family? Do we want to have kids? Obviously, that changes what I do with bodybuilding, right? But coming off of 22, I kind of just want to say, you know what? I just want to do one more show. I don't worry about the placing. I want to be able to just kind of get the monkey off my back, to build confidence that I could show up for myself when it counted, because it's easy to show up for yourself on the small decisions. But if you're not someone who's like great at being on stage, it's a very different skill set that I had not owned yet. So I wanted to see that growth. We started prep for Puerto Rico Pro, and that show was canceled. And so we extended that out to Chicago Pro. We chose Puerto Rico because it was a smaller show and it was kind of like Dave and I could take a little vacation after. So the whole point was not even to go in and win. But the point was just to be able to go and feel like I actually belonged on that stage and showed up in a way that if I were to watch on the outside, said, I'm really proud of her. And that's something I think that translates to a lot of other sports, whether it's, powerlifting, bodybuilding, or anything that we do, is being able to show up as the person we want to be. And I'm not going to say that there was a pressure off moment. It's not like I tapped the pressure release valve, because as soon as Puerto Rico got canceled, it was like, great. Now, this prep is hard. Extending that out longer wasn't something I was excited about. But it did make me lean into the parts of myself that I needed to facilitate and I needed to acknowledge in order to show up as that. Like, I needed to trust my own mental resilience. I needed to trust that I could do the things that felt, I don't want to say impossible, but I needed to know that I could do the things that cultivated trust, for lack of a better word. Because if I could trust myself in the small things, why wouldn't I be able to trust myself when those small things need to come together? And it's a very obvious thing to say out loud, but again, it's one thing to see it from a bird's eye view and kind of know the concepts are there and intellectualize it versus really internalizing it.
Well, there's a caveat there too, because if you're in prep and there's all those small things, there's a lot of those small things, and a lot of those small things you'll miss here and there. It's just a kind of a normal part of the whole thing. One meal gets missed or whatever it's going to be, and or timing's off or something. I mean, I don't want to sit here and say that people are cheating all the time, but
there are exchanges.
There's exchanges.
Small exchanges.
There's small exchanges, but those can impact that mindset when you go to put them all together.
Absolutely.
Because you can either think of the 3 things that you screwed up, which were very minor.
Yeah, like I ate zucchini instead of yellow squash.
Yeah. Or
that's what happened. Like, that's what people think about.
Well, that's kind of where I'm getting to is it's like if there's 100 comments and 99 of them are positive, you're going to focus on the one negative.
Sure.
Same type of thing there, until you can create that mental shift to realize that, wow, 99 people thought this was really great. So were you able to completely do that, or do it enough to make a significant difference?
I really want to think about that, because I think this is an important thing for people in general, whether, again, they're getting ready for anything big. I think the idea of being able to trust yourself is so, so, so important. I think there was a lot of just letting go and a lot of surrender. And if there was one word that I would have to look at for last year for me, it would be the idea of surrender. And there's a lot of peace that comes with that. And if there's one thing that I think these iron sports really lack, it's a sense of peace. We always put a lot of pressure on ourselves to show up a certain way, to accomplish a certain task. There's constant comparison without us even recognizing it as soon as we watch what other people are doing, right? And that erosion of peace is one of the biggest things I think it's very intertwined with not being able to trust ourselves.
Would you say that the degree of discipline that's required within the prep creates an environment that would be a distraction from what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And you're just so tired. People think that you're going to be hungry in a bodybuilding prep. It's never the hunger. Like, you might be hungry for like a couple weeks, but after that, it's just like existing feels hard. Like talking is hard. I do think it's a distraction. And I think a lot of people use prep as a distraction from what needs to happen. I know I did. I've had, this year, my training's been almost entirely taken away from me. And I realize now how much my training was a distraction. And it was, I put these little like medals on top of it and like built it up as this armor. It's like, it's this great thing. And it is. It's a huge part of where I've taken myself clinically and professionally, but it is absolutely a distraction from who we are is what's going on in here. And what is happening internally will always have a bigger play on the external environment and what we put out than the small actions of making sure you're eating zucchini instead of yellow squash.
So if it wasn't that, would it just be something else?
What do you mean in terms of?
As far as the distraction?
Yeah, I think, people are, there's a reason that I forget the statistic. I want to say it's something like 80% of people, if given two options, will move away from what hurts rather than towards what they want. And I think that extrapolates over almost everything. And so whether it's training or something else, most of us have some distraction unless we're willing to, everyone says like do the internal work. That is hard. It is really hard. And the more we talk about it, I think it kind of trivializes or dismisses it in a way. But when you're 20% of people who really do move towards what you want, you really start to realize how many things are prohibiting you from doing that very thing.
Yeah. Well, the other piece of that is when you're doing all the things to move towards what you want, that still doesn't guarantee success.
Yeah. That is very true.
So it's figuring out how to, God, this is so oversaid, embrace the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know if it's really so much that as it is, embrace where you are currently in time, right? Because you can't change the past. You can't predict the future, but you can control what you're currently doing, right? And most people are going to look past future. Like, I'm doing this so I can look this way on the stage, right? But if the tricky part there is if you're only living in the actual moment, then you may not be doing the things that could potentially lead for that success.
Yeah, it's that sweet spot of knowing where you want to go and having vision without losing sight of what's right in front of you.
Yeah.
And I think the more people hyper-focus on things, I love this analogy of like, when I said the word surrender, your facial expression was one that was kind of like interesting.
Yeah.
But kind of what I mean by that was the more we hyper-focus on things, whether it's even trying to be present in the moment and be grateful for, what's now versus knowing where we want to go. And again, that fine tuning of present, but also future oriented, we start to kind of hang on to things so tightly. And the more tightly we hang on to things, there's this perception of fragility in our brain that I think happens. And as soon as we start thinking from that fragility, like, my gosh, I have to do these things or this isn't going to happen,
Mm-hmm.
I think it really shifts our nervous system into a very sympathetically driven state. And there's research now that comes out and actually looks at even just recognizing like when we feel understood as people. And this can come from yourself or from someone else mirroring your emotions. There's a different part of the brain that activates and generally has a more positive affect versus if we don't feel understood or if we're concerned or overly concerned, different part of the brain is activated. And so at any given point in time, we might think that it's a very positive thing, but subconsciously, the more we hang on to this kind of fragility, instead of just kind of letting it go a little bit, I think that comes back to the kind of trust.
Well, it's easier said than done.
It is.
So
it is.
What are the things that you've implemented to be able to move towards that? And I choose my words correctly, right? Because I said move towards because I don't think anybody's ever going to be there.
I want to give Chris Edmonds a big shout. So I worked with Justin for my diet last year. And Justin is an incredible person. And I did not realize how much I was standing on his shoulders until working with someone else now. Chris last year was so pivotal for me. I've never had someone that just had such an unwavering belief in me. And it took a lot of work for me to learn how to receive that. I think his mindset coaching and the way that he approached me as an athlete, the way that he approached me as a person was something that was so different from how I've been spoken to before, or how I've been approached before, that it was like, oh my gosh, there's this entirely new stimulus. So, I mean, the long and short of that is like having the right people around you is important. For me, I don't know how much we can or even really should get into this on the podcast, but for me, like my faith was hugely tested. Mm-hmm. And that was the thing that kept me put together. Like before getting on stage at Chicago Pro, whether it was the night before where I slept 15 minutes, maybe, if that, all the things that roll into when you're so physically depleted and you feel you are truly at your weakest, you're left looking at what are you standing on? Because all the other cards in your house of cards have been taken away. That for me was period, full stop. That was it.
Mm-hmm. So when we get to, we'll go back here a little bit to the win, right? So with all this being said, what was that like?
I thought it was going to be like this whole redeeming, like, oh my gosh, like I felt great. So Bob Chick is the announcer for the IFBB. And at the end of the show, or, when they're handing out awards and Olympia qualifications, wild to say, he was like, oh yeah, I'm sure you were standing in the mirror, like talking to Hairbrush, like, thinking about your speech for after, like you knew you were going to win. Cause that's how most people are. But you've known me probably about 10 years now. Have you ever seen me like that? No, never. Like that is not my MO. And so I was like, no, that was not me at all, Bob. And he was like, oh, okay. And just like moved on to the next thing. So I thought it was going to be this big, like I proved to myself that I could show up. But all it did, because of where I was internally, was kind of go, well, crap, there's another success. I need to succeed higher or I'm going to be found out that I don't actually belong here. So every step of success, and I see this throughout my life, every time I've had any level of success, I've interpreted that as, I don't know if that was actually true. I need to not only repeat that, but do something better so that I know that that level was actually true. And I'm going to tell you, making it to the Olympia stage and very, very fast timing, talk about ultimately having that house of cards knocked over. That was it. Because as much as you can say like, oh, it's really cool to have made it there, I realized very quickly that no matter how well or how poorly I had done, or how well I showed up for myself, again, kind of coming back to the trust that was there for Chicago in 23, it still left me wondering what impact that was going to have on anyone around me. I don't want to say that competing and winning is hollow, because it's not. There's so much that comes with that, and there's so much enrichment. But my response to getting there was just, how can I gave so much into this prep and pulled out of relationships, not pulled out, but basically had to, step back from them. I knew I wasn't giving my clients what they deserved because I was just so tapped out. My body was shut down. We can talk about that too. But what was the exchange? Because everything we do, there's always an exchange. And for me, the exchange of being able to get on that stage and what I gave up to be there, I really had to look at my value system and wonder, was that worth it? And if I can ever make it back there again, man, I sure hope I can. I'm not putting that out of the cards. If I can ever make it back there again, the thing I would do differently was just make sure that while I stuck true to my values about 90%, which is pretty good. And that sounds like only 90%, but when again, you're that depleted, that's pretty darn solid. That wasn't good enough for me. And I would always exchange knowing that I stayed true to my personal value system as best possible for a success that is only mine.
Well, how are you going to define a personal value system, right? And if we just, the way that I'll kind of look at that is, I'll have whatever my core values are, and there's, 5 of them or whatever it is. And I'm not going to broadcast, what they all are, but they all kind of operate on a scale, 0 plus 10, 0 minus 10. And it's going to deviate, right? So, if it 4 standard deviations away from 0, then that should be a clue. Let's dial it back in. But it's never going to stay right where it needs to be, right? So it becomes a matter of how many deviations are you going to allow this to move in either direction. So when you're at, say, at 90%, I'm kind of, that seems like a bar graph instead of a sliding scale, which is kind of what values are going to kind of really work on, because we're all human. It would be impossible to always be that 100%.
Oh, for sure.
But, the caveat there is that how many standard deviations you start to move away in either direction consistently, I would start to question, is this even a value at all?
One way that I like to look at this too is the idea of a water balloon. Is it should maintain the same volume, right? Now, if you squeeze it a little bit, it's going to change shape.
Yeah.
But the volume should still, that balloon should still hold the same amount of water. So when I talk 90%, I'm like, okay, was my water balloon inflated to 100% or was my water balloon deflated to 90%, even if there's a change in shape. So let's say you have core value X and core value Y, right? Like you might need to lean into one a little bit and there's a different change, kind of fluidity there, but it's never going to deviate so much that the overall volume changes or you totally lose one completely. So I think that's probably the most accurate way that I see things in terms of how things played out last year.
Yeah. So then what was the plan after the show?
Which?
The Olympia.
There wasn't one really.
Well, with that in mind, that was a year of prep almost? 9 months?
Yeah, so we started prep in February, and this was November. And Dave, I'm going to say Dave, listeners, my husband's name is Dave, so I always get confused when I talk to Tate. Anyway, Dave was in prep for nationals at that point too. So it was kind of like, let's just get him through nationals, which was beginning of December, and then get through the holidays, and then we'll see. Throughout most of prep last year, when I was working with Justin, we didn't notice at the time. So throughout prep, I really understate how much it's impacted me, but I was having some small seizures almost weekly, especially towards the end. Like it was like leg day, we basically knew. And Dave and our other training partner, Christian, they just knew. They were like, it's going to be this set. This is when it's going to happen. And
now, this is an issue that you've had for years prior, correct?
This is something that came up a few years ago and was kind of told it's probably something autoimmune, but we'll be able to diagnose you as more antibodies show up. And if you know anyone that's dealt with autoimmune stuff, it's kind of like going to the DMV. Like you walk in and you're going to be sitting there for a while, but you have no idea how long. And you'll watch other people kind of walk in after you and get see and then get out. And you're kind of like, should I just come back a different day?
Yeah.
So honestly, I wrote it off, and I for the last 4 years kind of gaslit myself. I said it's all in my head. There's nothing wrong with me. Not nothing, but it's very small. It shouldn't be having this kind of impact. And so all through prep and even, other times I've had some small episodes come up. I basically just said, there's nothing wrong with you. It's in your head, and push myself to work through it. Meanwhile, I'm running fevers consistently after training. I think there was 1 week where I ran a fever every day. And still did, 45 minutes of stairs twice a day, plus 10,000 steps on no food. And so after the Olympia, I think Justin and I both realized at that point, because my body just stopped, and what we brought to the Olympia stage was not at all what it does not reflect the effort that went in. So I finally started to go and get some blood work done, and I think the tipping point for me was my joints hurt so bad, and I thought it was just related again to prep. But at one point, holding a coffee mug, I was dropping things constantly because my hands just hurt so bad. And knowing what I do a little bit about, the inflammatory process and things like that, I was like, maybe this is just some sort of a histamine intolerance, because we know that histamine can create pain and inflammation, that whole cycle. And so I started taking some antihistamines routinely, and I was loading up on them, and my pain got a lot better. And at that point I kind of said, okay, maybe it's time to look into some of the physiology of what's driving some of this. So, knowing that I was going into the Olympia so debilitated, there are videos of me training where I'm making myself, cry training, which looks hardcore or whatnot. But really what it was at that point is I just wanted to make it through another session without feeling like I was going to be my CNS was shot for 2 to 3 days after. Because that's what would happen. And it was this cycle. How do we get on this topic?
It's what you, after the Olympia,
okay.
What was next?
So I started, I got some blood work done. I reached out to Austin Stout, who I'm now working with for a coach. And rheumatology said, yeah, you've got a lot of stuff showing up. It's probably lupus. And again, if you're someone who's dealt with anything autoimmune, you know that that diagnosis is tough, because you'll have blood work that says these antibodies are present, but at the same time, it's one of those diseases that, while it can sustain throughout a lifetime, it's also kind of one of those catch-alls where doctors are kind of well, we don't really know what else this is, so we'll just call it,
it's kind of poorly defined.
It's very poorly defined. And so what that meant to me as an athlete was, okay, I need to actually take care of myself, because I had not. And if I look back at the last probably 6 to 8 years, I've not done that. And I've really denied what my body has been trying to tell me. And so we hear a lot about, there's that book. What book am I thinking of? You probably have heard of it.
If you give me a little more
it's like the body internalizes a lot of stress. The body keeps score. So I started looking at, what do I actually need to change internally? And getting to some very old, deep wounds that drove a lot of patterns. And, at the time that I started working with Austin, again, Chris has been with me through this whole thing too, peeling back these layers, and basically having training kind of taken away so that my body could recover has been very, very eye-opening to me. And it's interesting being here on a table talk. And I think at one point earlier this year, I was like, man, if I show up to Elite and I don't even look like I train anymore, am I going to be taken seriously at all? And I probably for the first time ever, I can step back and go, it really doesn't matter. The people that you've worked with, the people who now can like hang out with their kids and have a bar on their back without hurting, that carries more weight than anything. And so I think that's kind of where, coming back to the Olympia, where I felt like, that last card in that house of cards, if I reached something that most people would only dream of, and I still felt like this was cool, but it didn't connect with my why and the purpose that goes into, if we have our core values, ultimately they serve some purpose, right? So what is that? So long-winded way of saying, I got to accomplish something in a very short amount of time, and it was awesome. And I hope that I can do it again. And the next time I do it, I really hope that there's a purpose within that, and that I can lean into bringing others with me in a better way. Because I think with leadership, one of the things that we know, whether we're coaching or just leading people in our own lives, we know that we're bringing people from wherever they are to where they want to be and hope to be, and kind of including them in that.
I don't think the purpose would be within that. I think that would help to serve whatever purpose you have.
Probably.
Right. To where I think that's where a lot of competitors get this mixed up. The purpose is, a world record, Olympia stage, whatever it's going to be.
Yeah.
But that, and just to peel it way back and make it less purpose oriented from a bigger purpose, that may drive their business. So say their purpose is to grow a bigger business, which is kind of a shitty purpose, but for conversation's sake, right? It's to be able to drive, that better business. Well, then that should help drive, serve whatever that bigger purpose is. When that's the complete total purpose, then I don't think you're ever going to be able to get to the level that they'd want to get to.
Sure.
Because the identity becomes completely associated with that, right? And I think we've all kind of suffered from that. But if there's this higher purpose, which is what everybody kind of struggles with, then how does this play into that higher purpose, right? And once that's figured out, it becomes a different process.
Right.
Right. Because the faith, for however you want to say it, is going to kind of always be there, because no matter how it goes, it's going to be okay.
Right. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you don't put all effort into it.
Absolutely. It's not an excuse to just hands off. So I think you hit on a really big topic there, with the idea of identity role confusion. When it comes to, like, I feel like we've used the word purpose so many times in the last 5 minutes, but, truly, I think that there are a lot of very lost people who, it's very easy to stray from that. It's really easy to lose yourself as soon as you start putting a lot of effort into things. And I think it's easier said than done to remain true to those roots in every moment. I had something else I was you said something that really was like, oh man, that was big. That's what she said. But,
well, it's kind of like a hierarchy, right? To where if things are laid out and nothing is laid out in the way people think that it's, this straight line hierarchy, right? But if that hierarchy is, faith, family, and then everything that would fall underneath all that, then what happens is the things that fall underneath all that, go up top, and then everything else, for some will be suppressed, but for most just gets pushed out, entirely. And when you look through that, and faith can be defined how anybody wants to define faith. How I'm going to define it's going to be, based upon my religious beliefs. But, it's just how everybody's going to put that just a little bit differently. And that's internal. Like, so the faith is an internal thing. The family's going to last longer, or should, than the sport or everything else. And when you look at the priorities, people think it needs to be 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's really a synergy.
Absolutely.
Of how all that plays. And if it's not a synergy of how all that plays, then you're going to have mental gymnastics all the time.
Yes.
Because I'm not putting enough here. I'm not putting enough here. I'm not putting enough here. And there's no answer to that. Because even if you are putting enough there, you're going to think that you're not. And if you are putting more here, you're going to think it needs to be here. Right. And it's just this big clusterfuck.
Yeah.
Of all that, unless, there's faith involved. And with that faith, the faith can be, for non-religious people, that faith can just be simply everything's going to be okay.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be fine. And it plays into the rest of your life. And that's where and there's trade-offs, right? Because some of these sports are more dangerous than others.
For sure.
So if that top end faith is based upon health and longevity, well, then you got a lot of questions going on really quick.
Yeah.
When you're in starvation mode and your brain isn't working right and all these other things. So then you start questioning, like, what the fuck am I doing and all that. But when it's synergistically combined, you would be, if you're in a good relationship, you'd be more than happy to die for your child or die for your partner. Right. And I'm not saying that synergistic thing means you should kill yourself trying to get ready for a show,
right?
But it's a little bit better balance. Man, that was a little fucked up to say it that way.
It's not the first time.
Yeah, exactly. So where are you now then?
Can you clarify the question so I can?
Well, just from the bodybuilding perspective. So it's are you training? Are you not training? Is there anything that you have in sight that you're looking for, or is it just working this? Summer's here and so is the heat. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms, and I know most of you that are training in garage gyms, private gyms, black iron gyms, know what I'm talking about when I say the heat sucks. It kills your motivation to go to the gym. It kills your performance, but it doesn't have to if you keep your electrolytes up. That's why today's episode is sponsored by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink with everything you need and nothing you don't. This means lots of salt with none of the junk. No sugar, no colors, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. It contains an electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Element can help prevent and eliminate headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, brain fog, sleeplessness, and other common symptoms associated with electrolyte deficiency. Right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. Get yours at drinkelement.com. This deal is only available through the Table Talk link. You're looking to boost recovery, enhance your sex drive, and improve performance in the gym. Do you think your hormones are out of whack and you're tired of getting the runaround from your doctor? Things like your hormones are just fine, stop lifting heavy weights, etc., etc., etc. I know what that feels like, as I've been down that road most of my life. This is why we've partnered with Merrick Health. Merrick Health is a premium telehealth platform that specializes in hormone optimization and preventative medicine, ensuring a better quality of life. Merrick Health offers a Table Talk panel tailored for our listeners, featuring comprehensive tests like total and free testosterone, sensitive estradiol, and advanced markers like lipoprotein A and IGF-1. These comprehensive panels of up to 84 carefully selected biomarkers allow you to identify areas of enhancement and maximize your physical, cognitive, and sexual performance. It's much different than the panels you may get from your doctor. Choose between self-service options where you can select lab panels based upon decades of experience, or opt for guided optimization with your own health coach. Start with a detailed breakdown of your labs and receive personalized treatment options, both over the counter and prescription. Visit merrickhealth.com/table talk and use the code table talk to get 10% off your first order. Merrick Health isn't just about better health, it's about empowering you to take control of your well-being.
Right now, I'm in this continued kind of healing phase, and it has gone on way, way, way longer than I anticipated. And it's been really good. I needed it. Like, if I'm honest, there was a point this year where I was sick of training. I didn't want to train anymore because I'd spent the last many years doing something that I tied my entire identity to and gotten lost in. I would love to get back on stage again. But right now, you know, the whole reason that I share any of this purpose is like, I'm not genetically gifted. And I also feel I really can resonate with people who constantly feel like they have something to prove and like they're not enough. As a doctor of physical therapy who's thrown herself into training as the way that her treatment model has evolved, someone who's been through not only injuries with tendon ruptures and things like that, and now some significant medical issues, my whole hope is that I'm so desperate to communicate to people that with the right help and the right people and the right system, your best really doesn't have to be behind you. So what I'm doing right now is basically trying to rebuild myself. And it's taken some time, and there's a lot of patience involved with that. But I think there's a lot of power in our stories. And I think maybe that's kind of what I was trying to hit on earlier when I was talking about, you know, purpose and all of that, is that, you know, when I look at the story of last year and the story of, you know, externally, it was like, cool, like she won a pro show. That's a really big deal. People look at, you know, social media and it's become so easy to talk about who wins pro shows, but you don't realize what it actually takes to do that. So people look back and like, she won a pro show. She went to the Olympia. Like, she's doing this stuff with Justin. Like, it all looked great. But the story behind that was one of someone who constantly just, future me needed to look at me and say, hey, like, sis, you got this. It's okay. You have anything to prove. And in fact, you hanging on so tightly to trying to prove things, that's just going to prohibit you from expressing it. So going forward, I think I need to be a little bit more upfront and honest and transparent about what a lot of the barriers from the health perspective have been like, and what that looks like to get back on stage. Man, I'm dying to get back on stage. Getting on stage, I'm dying to get back to training. Like, give me a bar in my hand so I can rip it off the floor. You know, like, that is what I'd love to do. So that's kind of where things are. I don't know if that fully answers the question.
No, but the honesty is important because you've been doing this for decades.
Yeah.
Right. And after a couple decades of doing this, it's not like the first 3 years of your training.
No, it's not.
Where you're just, when the workout's over, you're looking forward to the next one.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there's going to come a time for everybody to where, you know, training kind of sucks.
Yeah.
You know, and you got to make this decision. Do I back off from it? Do I walk away from it? How do you physically structure it? You know, and we can go into that conversation as well, because if you completely remove it entirely, there's going to be impacts that you may not expect, you know, but if you pull it back, there's still going to be impacts because you still don't want to do it. So you got to figure out, what can I do that I'll do, right? Which is kind of weird because that becomes your client base. So then you're able to better understand your clients, you know, because now you're living in that same mindset while distorted that they live in, because a lot of them may not actually want to train. They have to train.
Exactly.
You know, or if it's the rehab part, you know, they want it over as fast as it can possibly be over. And then that creates the issues there. So in the broad scope of all that, the way that I can look at this as an outsider looking in is going to give you a way better connection with the clients that you're working with.
For sure. So a lot of the people that I work with demographically are generally men in their late 20s, early 30s through like 45. And they're people who have been training for a while to the point to where they kind of push themselves to train through things because they thought they had to. And now they hurt a lot of places. They don't enjoy training, but they don't know what to do without it. And it's come at the exchange of being able to be present with their families, or the exchange of being able to get out of bed in the morning. So, some people, it's like, it's really severe. Other people, their pain point is just that they don't love training anymore because every time they do something, they know it's going to hurt. And I really resonate with where they are because there's almost this guilt associated with not wanting to train, right? And I think there's a narrative on social media, especially, again, like between both powerlifting and bodybuilding, that's like, well, just work harder, do things you don't want to do. And while that discipline is important, it can drive a lot of change in our neural networking, big time, with how we actually perceive the world around us. And again, our brain is constantly picking up on this stuff, and it changes how we respond. One of the things that I talk about a lot with my clients is like, they'll watch my husband train and like, man, I feel like there's something wrong with me because I'm not him. And I'm like, dude, you have 3 kids, you work overnight shifts, you've got all these other issues going on structurally, certain people are going to tolerate that type of training more consistently than others. And I'm not talking like, attachments. I'm talking like your axial skeleton can be structured a certain way that lends itself more to sustainable training. So those are people like Dave where it's not as hard on him physiologically. And you can watch him train. He's training hard. But because of the way that his body is put together and the layers that he's added on over the years, and again, I'm not talking only muscle, I'm talking like the compensatory layers that have actually served him very, very well. He can recover differently. And that changes his mindset. I mean, you get all these different factors that basically roll into how do we, the person, right? How do we coach the person when they don't want to train, when they hurt? What are the reasons? And it's so multifactorial. And I definitely think that one of the themes that I've seen over the last probably year especially is like, it's okay if you don't want to train right now. Let's have a conversation about it. And as soon as someone actually feels seen in that, you can almost see the relief come over their face. And that's kind of, I think I touched on this earlier, when people feel seen emotionally, there's a change in our amygdala that basically is associated with a positive affect, social connection, belonging, things that are part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So one of the most powerful things we can do as coaches is not sit here and minimize and say, man, you just got to work harder. There's a time and a place for that, right? There's a time and a place for the sense of urgency. But I think that when it comes to coaching, we very much need to be in tune with, okay, well, what narrative is this person receiving? And even ask them that. Well,
there's a couple points. Is a highly competitive coach, and by no means is all of them, right? Because it's never the case. May look at somebody because they don't have the same discipline they do, and then really question, like, what the hell? Like, all I'm asking you to do is to train 3 times a week. I train 6 times a week and I never miss, and all this is on point. So that mindset, because they're not able to relate with that other unless they're forced into a position to where that becomes the case because they just don't want to train, that happens a lot, so it's, for a lot of people, choose your coaches wisely, and the other part, well, I'm going to present this at a micro level, then have you expand on it from more of a macro level, is when you're looking at your mindset and your ability of your body to be able to recover from that stimulus training wise. We've all seen people say it's a max effort squat, right? So we've all seen people that will approach the bar with semi confidence, right? Then they're going to grind through it. It's like an RPE thing. Like with the RPE, I always ask, like, am I allowed to be psyched up or not psyched up?
Absolutely.
Right. So now if I'm allowed to be psyched up, right, and for me, it's ammonia and, all this other kind of stuff, then neurally, it's going to increase my confidence, but also it's taken my brain to a completely different state, which is going to put a completely different stimulus on me, which is going to make that harder to recover. So when I hear things like, your husband can train hard all the time, where my brain kind of defaults to is, this is probably a person that's kind of just chill most of the time. So he's not getting fired up for all these sets and all this other stuff. So if it's adrenaline or whatever it's going to be less to allow that to be able to happen. So while it could be, the same weight, it's 600 pounds, whatever it's going to be, that can be approached in 3 different mindsets. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this, or I'm totally confident I'm going to be able to get this, or I'm not sure and I have to find a way to be able to get that confidence, albeit ammonia music or whatever it's going to be. Now, through those same weight, same stimulus, only thing that changed is that mindset. Chemically, in your ability for systemic recovery or just recovery from that actual lift, how does that change?
Based on, so my
they're in a different brain state, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That has to have some kind of impact on their ability to systemically recover from whatever that lift is.
Absolutely.
Like if somebody's fired up for every set, first off, they're not going to be able to do very many.
Right.
But that next session, during that week, or that next session on the next week or whatever it's going to be, may be compromised because of that.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going. And my brain is like going 25 different directions with this too. I mean, this is probably more simple than it needs to be, but I think it really depends on that person's baseline. Because someone who generally gets like overly amped up for a lift, like we've all seen that person like ramp themselves up so much, and you're like, bro, like you're doing a set of like 10. You can't be amped up for 10 reps. I'm exhausted just looking at you.
Yeah.
But generally how someone approaches a bar, that tells me a lot about how that person approaches life. And I think that changes a lot of the coaching cues. And in general, and I could be way off here, but I think in general, different lifts may require a different kind of tap the button or a different one of those, mindsets, right? But the taxation of that is going to be different for everyone. So someone who's generally very, very low key, like Dave is, he's like, gosh, there could be a tornado going. He wouldn't be phased. For him to tap that button is much more exhausting than for someone like myself, who usually has spent a little bit more time more on edge than not. Not to say that it's healthy, but I think what we see more and more of is that it gets extrapolated over years, and it gets extrapolated through different systems. So because it's a higher taxation on Dave, I think that's a reflection of a probably healthier physiology if we're talking about like a normal, like a homeostatic just physiology. He's probably able to train more consistently over time without also acquiring all these other stress-related issues. Does that make sense? So again, I'll talk about myself because I'm NF1 and I've lived it. I can tap the button and I can, train really hard and do things that are not wise in training. And I will stuff that down just like I've stuffed down a lot of other stresses until the body does keep score and kind of says, hey, no. And so I think there's a little bit of a threshold that people maybe approach or maybe pull back from, depending on their training and their sensitivity levels to how they approach the bar and how they recover from that. In my mind, the bigger application is that tells me more about how long that person's going to be able to train. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Especially knowing where that baseline is, because let's say if he's at that baseline and he just goes one deviation over that, I would assume that the adaptation will come over time to where it could go to that. But when you're dealing with hypertrophy, the following question would be, is it necessary for the outcome that he's looking for? And it may not be, and that's where things get convoluted.
I think a lot of that depends on training age too.
Yeah.
I know that's something that you talk about a lot. And I think basically maybe this is a way that we could reverse engineer. How do we know what someone's training age? How do we know their potential for training age? Does that make sense? And there's a difference between a quiet confidence of this is going to suck, but I'm going to be able to do it. I will find a way, whether it's a max effort squat or deadlift or something like that, versus those people that get overly amped up, I tend to find are more unsure than sure.
Well, I would tend to agree with that only because they don't have to do that for the sets preceding that top one. right? So if it's 90%, they don't have to do it, but they have to do it for 95%.
Yeah.
Well, then the 90%, obviously they were confident this is not a big deal, right? The 95%, then it changes because maybe they're not confident.
Yeah.
And they need that extra arousal to be able to do that.
That optimal level of arousal is something that's so individualized.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really hard about. I think it's invaluable to training groups or to have a training partner, but it needs to be someone that understands your optimal level of arousal. So like when Dave and I were training for powerlifting, like I knew what he needed before his squat. I knew what he needed before his bench. I knew what he needed before his deadlift. And he knew the same for me. And it was different.
Mm-hmm.
And what he needs, in a hard set of hack squats. And if someone pulls up his Instagram, I mean, he's hack squatting 9 plates per side on the Arsenal, which is, it's just stupid. But he's not getting ramped up for that. But I know that he needs me to show up for him when he's at those last 3 reps. And I know exactly when that is. And that's when he needs to be able to tap the button.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's not just about, hyping up. It's knowing exactly when within a set that needs to happen. And there's that, again, I think comes with experience, training age. And honestly, just I don't want to say it's not that hard, but it's not that hard if you step back and you look at someone.
Well, it's what goes through my mind with conversations like this is, I've trained in groups before, and you have to understand who's doing the lifting, right? Because they may just be chill, but that's them. And if you get them overly hyped up, now it's a disaster, right? But there's going to be other people in that crew that are like, man, what the hell's wrong with him? And then they're trying to get them hyped up, right? And it becomes this, he's not even trying hard, and this whole different, or other people that have a tendency to, go here, like a vocal pole, to go here. And the whole game is how do you get him here? Yeah. How do you bring it down so at least there's some focus to make a correction if something's to go wrong during the lift?
I think that's a really important point too, is that as much as that optimal level of arousal, what people should feel. Right? What should you feel at that point? And the ability to focus is one of them for sure. And I think everyone is going to have a different thing that they need. So for me, example, when I get into a low bar back squat, I know that I need to be able to sense and feel certain parts of my feet. For me, I need my left heel. And I know that I need to, when I unrack the bar, be able to posterior expand my rib cage to lift the bar out. That takes a level of focus. If I get too ramped up, I can't find it. But I also know if there's no sense of urgency, I can't find those things. And so that's a different type of being, amped up than someone that needs to have a approach the bar aggressively with a really strong unrack. One is very technical, and one is there's going to be technique within it, but it is a little bit more of a mindset versus a proprioceptive feel. Well,
that's also one thing that with all the lifters that I've spoken to is, I guess I would define that as more tactile feedback. Is to be able to have that even with the maximum weights, because one of those things is off, your ribs, for instance, you're fucked. You're screwed. Yeah. Or you'll make it, but there may not be a third because you're going to be falling forward too much on the second.
We'll say the possibility of success is decreased.
Yes. So and this takes time. To develop all that, because with some of the guests that I've had, it's almost, they don't really know how they train, they just train hard, but there still is structure in there, and there are still commonalities amongst all of them because everybody trains different at the top level. And one of those commonalities I found is they know exactly where their position is supposed to be at the start, midpoint, basically throughout the whole lift.
Sure.
And if the tension's not right, say if it's in a quad or whatever it's going to be, they know what to do, to be able to shift, to be able to put the tension where it needs to be, or not unrack, reset, whatever, kind of follows from that. And regardless of the training methodology, that's a commonality across all of them.
For sure.
And maybe a couple freaks that, which exist. But even there, if you really start talking to them about, one of the questions I like to ask is walk me through how you do this lift.
Yeah.
What happens? And it's so automatic that sometimes it's hard for them to really think back to it. But you'd be surprised at how dialed in some of that is. I'm feeling it too much in my quads. I got to, push the knees out to be able to feel more in the glutes. And, things that are happening, you've done it. I mean, anybody that's done it, it's while it's still only 5, 6, 7 seconds, feels like forever.
Yeah.
Because you're able to make those corrections and have that dialogue in your head to be able to do that, to where if the dialogue in the head is only, you know, you just hope for the best, but that's how everybody starts.
Yeah.
Let's move on to pain. Right?
Yeah.
Because that's first, define that for me.
So I would say that the pain is basically at its simplest level, your body's way of, or your brain's way of trying to give attention that says, hey, something might not be good here. I don't know what that is, but let's take a closer look at this area. It's kind of like raising the red flag.
Well, I mean, let's back up a little bit. So if we're dealing with the scale, you know, of pain, you know,
are you talking like a 0 to 10?
Yeah, whatever, 0 to 10, whatever it's going to be. That's always been confusing to me as well, because your 4 may be different than my 4. So what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
Especially if you've never had a 4 before, you know, they may say it a 10. Now, I guess I'll put a caveat out there. Anytime I've ever had surgery, I've trained myself as soon as I come out to say 10, you know, that way, because if I'm going to stay overnight, I want to be doped up the whole time I'm there because I hate a hospital. So anyhow, that's just a fun joke, I suppose. But just that alone is where things get confused in my head. Right? Because it's when we're talking about pain, we're going to talk about training through pain. We're going to talk about, you know, rehab, recovery, all these other type of things. But at the base of all that is, how is that going to be anchored with, if you're the therapist working with them and the client / patient? Somehow that has to be anchored to where you kind of both are on that same page, or does it not?
I think it depends. It really depends. And I think this is where, you know, just years of practicing really kind of comes into play here, because of course at first like, oh, we got to establish a baseline. So we have something like measure things relative to, but there are some people where I won't ask 0 to 10 and there's not an anchor. Sometimes the KPI is more a movement. It's there or it's not. Mm-hmm. The pain is there in the movement or it's not. And I would say there are different kind of archetypes of people that I work with, where as soon as I start talking to them, I know there's someone I'm going to ask for a numerical scale, and I don't care what that is. Like, I'll give them a frame of reference. Well, you know, 0 is not there at all, and 10 is, you know, you're being drawn and quartered. Where are you there? And whether or not it is relative to what they're feeling, always. And that's the hardest thing, and kind of what you hit on with like, well, how do you know like what a 4 is? You know. So one thing that I'll look at too is like, you can give someone like this is super, super gimmicky. I'm going to get laughed at so hard here. You can give people a color chart, and like, you know, that there's an association between like something that's like red hot, like just angry looking, versus like, you know, you're starting to come down in that kind of like different areas. You can use something like that. And depending on how people process things, especially if someone is a visual processor, most of us are visual processors. So if you're a visual processor versus someone who's like more of a gut, like you got a gut feel on something, like if someone asks me a 0 to 10 pain, I can give you a number. And I know subjectively, I'm like, okay, that's just relative to where I am right now, there's only so much weight on that, right? But for someone who's a visual processor, being able to find a different way to communicate that's important. And I think that as a care provider, as a coach, as whatever you're doing, like one of the best things we can do to service our clients is to get out of a conventional model that we're all taught and recognize that those models, while they served a purpose for a time, like, come on, let's get real. And that Western medicine is failing us in a lot of ways. And we need to think differently as care providers. We absolutely have to. So sometimes I'll talk about anchoring pain in terms of a number. Sometimes it'll be a color. Sometimes it'll be tied to a movement. There are a lot of ways that we can talk about that. And if it's someone who's been in pain for a long time, I'm even going to change how I talk to that person. Because a lot of times, as soon as someone feels seen, what they think is like an 8, they're like, oh, I'm safe now. I guess it's really like a 6. That is a big KPI to me. That tells me there's a big psychological component. And one of my biggest roles as a coach is to make sure that I'm meeting them where they are and creating a space for them to be seen and heard.
So is their pain becoming part of their identity?
maybe, not always, because I do talk to some people who, and I know what you mean, where some people, like, they always have to be hurting. They don't know how to exist without it. But I think a lot of it has to do with whether or not they've been given the opportunity to process that pain. There are other people, again, that don't talk about pain with at all, because it depends on their, where they are, who they are as people, where they are in their year, their training goals, what sport they're competing in, if they're competing. And I also don't want to give too much power to that pain, because what we talk about, we give power to. So there's a lot of nuance. And I think the communication component is more important than whether or not we anchor ourselves to it.
So then would it become more range of motion that you're going to look at?
It depends. And I've got a really different viewpoint of range of motion. I want to come back to pain for a minute, because I think especially for these listeners with powerlifting and things of development, like, most of us are going to have some variation of like arthritis, or we're totally of like bone on bone and things like that. And even hearing that narrative, like someone tells me I have bone on bone and I'm going to hurt, like, period. But I think what's most important to recognize about pain is just how multifactorial it is. On a chemical level, like I was reading a study, and I wish I remember the specifics, but talked about how in hips, the type of pathology between arthritis, FAI, and hip dysplasia, they have different types of substances, whether it's, substance P, or I think bradykinin was another one, versus a decrease in the density of mechanoreceptors, things like that change. Now, that's all hip pain, right? Like, we could put that all in the bucket of hip pain. So that's why it's important, I think, to really look at the multifactorial components. If we've got, personal factors, we have biomechanical factors, we've got chemical factors, we've got lifestyle factors, we've got recovery factors, we've got things like kinesiophobia and like, fear avoidance. There's so many things. And then honestly, the biggest one is kind of that X factor. Like that person who's just so resilient. And the person I think of when I think about this is like Stacy Burr. Talk about like she's got that X factor. She walks in the room, no matter who's there, things are going to get better, right? But not everyone has that. Some may have it to different degrees. But when it comes to pain, part of why it's so hard to nail down that you're like, is this a 10? Is this a 2? I don't know. Is that you're trying to put a number on something that has so many factors that you can't even like cognitively process and put words to. We just know there's stuff getting sent up to the brain that's going to be sent on neurons that travel at different speeds depending on myelination, because not all nerve fibers are myelinated the same way. So we're trying to simplify something and almost corner someone and putting a number on something that is really hard to quantify.
Yeah. Well, that then becomes the issue of if they are injured, or doing any exercise. I mean, the general advice is if it hurts, don't do it. Right?
Yeah.
All right. So now we're going back to this thing here to where it may be the thing that they need to do, or it may not be the thing that they need to do. And that is where a lot of that confusion then comes, right? Because if post-traumatic injury, post-surgery knee or whatever it's going to be, it's going to hurt. So if that logic were to hold true, you would probably never regain any function because you would never move it. So there, you get where I'm going there.
I do.
So because that's the first line of defense from anybody. If it hurts, don't do it. And that's where does that, well, I guess where it would come from is, liability. I suppose would be the first place that's going to come from, which will go back to where you say, modern medicine's kind of screwed to begin with, because that's a thing, is to avoid that at all costs. So to avoid that at all costs is going to create issues with that as well. So with that in mind, if it's post-injury or whatever it's going to be, then how does that pain or maybe not dictate what they should or should not do?
Well, I think what you're hitting on is, so there are a couple considerations to make here, right? One, obviously, is that pain is multifactorial, which I just talked about. The second would be that not all pain is the same. So we've got something like a traumatic injury. We've got surgical pain. We've got The little like niggles you get in training that only happens at one particular point in your squat pattern, or like only happens at a certain percentage when you're doing your back offsets or something, right? Those are different inherently. And then the third consideration to make when thinking about pain, again, this is going to sound really cheesy, but I think that different pain has a different kind of personality, and that ultimately dictates how and when we move through it. So point blank, we don't need better pain management. We need a better paradigm. We need a better lens to assess and look at, and a framework to which we can then find action, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So when I talk about the pain not all being the same, I mean, I had someone I worked with in the clinic. This is, probably about 10 years ago now. Longer than that, because I was still an aide. And I'll never forget this experience. We were talking about his back pain, and he was like, you ever been in a classroom where there's just a kid in the back of the room just like blowing spitballs at you, and they only do it when you're trying to like say something? I was like, no, but I get a visceral feeling with that. And that is something that has always conceptually stayed with me, because you've also got that pain that the second you get up tells you sit down, you're not capable of anything. And when you give this pain a voice, there's a concept in a lot of therapies that kind of say name it to tame it. But pain, because we experience it in our brain, I think there's a level to that. And when you can validate and come alongside and say alongside someone and kind of say, man, that pain sounds like the kind of thing that you'll be doing just fine, and then pulls the rug out from under you. Man, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And then there's a level of understanding and a dialogue, and then you're on the same page, and you can really start to explain things a little bit. Maybe not explain things, but you can listen as a provider and practitioner. And the better understanding you get about what this pain means to someone, what it means within their value system, you can start to get a better picture of where to go. Because ultimately, how aggressively we treat this pain and how we speak to them is going to be a direct reflection, or needs to be a direct reflection, of that person's value system that is going to happen through conversation. People ask me all the time, they're like, why are you spending so much time getting to know me as a person? I said, well, I need to know what this means to you. Is this the kind of thing where your value system is you just want to be able to pick up your kid? Because I'm going to progress your training and rehab differently than someone who's got to be on a platform in 8 weeks. Very different. Mm-hmm. So when we think about, if it hurts, just don't do it. At some point, we need to lean into things, right? But again, this is a model failure more than anything. And that model has changed the psychological narrative that most of us have when we approach pain. We think of pain as the bad thing. My gosh, my knee really hurt during that squat. Maybe I should be more careful. Maybe, or maybe it's data collection, right? That's what you need to get with someone who can actually try and assess things for you a little bit. But that assessment, I think, needs to be not purely biomechanical, but not too feelsy either. Don't get me wrong. Like, I sound like I sit here and I just talk to people and try and talk them out of pain. Like, that's not it. My people work hard. But without that commonality of being seen as a person, it's really hard as a coach or doctor or therapist, whatever role you play, to work with someone in pain. Does that?
Yeah, it does, unless they're not working with anybody. They're just trying to navigate this on their own.
Sure. That's a really good challenge point. So to people like that, I still think it's really important to get a better understanding. And I don't mean like, okay, there are components to understanding your pain, right? Like, some of it is actually stepping back and saying, okay, well, it only hurts when I do this. I don't feel it when I do this other movement, but when I'm sitting at my desk during the day, that gets there. That's one component to understanding it, right? But then the other component is actually, I think, being able to have the altitude to see the 30,000 foot up view of other things that may be contributing to it. Things that you don't think about. A lot of times there are movements in our training that have a secondary or tertiary effect on a body part. For example, if you're a conventional deadlifter and you're very, very back dominant, I wouldn't be surprised if that contributed to knee pain. Not one bit. I've seen it a lot. Mm-hmm. So there are always kind of more facets to look at if you can be curious, rather than have that sense of urgency and the fragility that comes with having to fix it versus kind of sitting back and getting some altitude.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a lot.
I'm trying to process it all, because if you take, certain individuals say there's certain movements I can't do, right? So it's range of motion, pain, or whatever it's going to be. And so you just disregard those, to where I've had people say, no, don't disregard those, try to put those back in. And it's like a risk benefit. Like, I don't really like them in the first place. Why should I put them back in? Or the range of motion just isn't going to exist to be able to be there. But if that's all I ever did, then I probably wouldn't be able to do anything right now. You lose the ability. Yeah. So there's navigating that landscape of trying to figure out what needs to, I guess where I'm going with this is there's training, and then over the last, it's probably been longer than 5 years or so, training throughout greater ranges of motion that you'd be required to go, increasing tolerance, of certain movements, so powerlifters are always the greatest example because they're experts in trying to take a movement and make it the shortest movement possible. Then if all they do is, squat, bench, and deadlift, and then their ability for the pec tendon to be able to handle if the bar shifts a little bit too far one way, blows, to where if they were to add in machine flies or cambered bar press, or just a little bit deeper into that range of motion to increase that tolerance. So the question I've always had with that, first off, is this even true or not? Because a lot of the times when we'll see injuries like that happen, they're acute, right? So, if a bar goes this far this way, I don't know how much pec flies or camber bars are really going to help in that case, where increasing that, and that's going to come at a cost, especially if you're dealing with somebody that doesn't understand that maybe a loaded stretch with a 10-pound dumbbell for 30 or 60 seconds is sufficient, where others are going to be, no, that needs to be a 100-pound dumbbell. You get what I'm saying with all that kind of stuff. So I guess the question would fall into increasing that resilience outside of the normal range of motion that they were required to be in. Two-facet question. A, is it going to actually, God, I hate to ask this because it prevent injury, which I don't know if that really kind of make it less likely, of injury. And B, is it going to help the main lifts at the same time?
I want to make sure. So it sounds like what you're trying to hit on is, does increasing movement variability away from the big three, whatever you're competing in, does increasing movement variability have positive effects on resilience if things go wrong?
Yes. Or just joints in general. So say somebody with a 22-inch arm, that's developed, is probably going to begin to have less range of motion in the elbow joint than somebody that's got a 12-inch arm, to where could they put in movements like dumbbell overhead press or overhead French press at a loaded stretch just to be able to maintain some of that integrity, of the joint. And does it have value? And B, if it outside of that value, is it going to be able to help them get the 23-inch arm that they want?
My brain is going, there's so many different directions I could take this. And
I can use another example.
This is great.
Most squats are, outside of Olympic lifters, most squats are like parallel squats, right? So most people who train in the gym very rarely are going to go ass to grass on anything, to where, I've heard some, and I've been an advocate of this, at the end of your squat day, grab onto a power rack and just sit in the lowest position you possibly can. Just, if anything, just to be able to maintain the mobility or whatever. All right. In principle, it sounds like a good idea. In application, is it or is it not?
Gosh, all these examples are great. The reason I'm having such a hard time answering this question is because I'm debating how much framework to lend before I start answering. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So do I think movement variability is good? Yes, ultimately, yeah. But it needs to be periodized, right? Like someone who is 4 weeks out from a meet doesn't need to be doing anything other than maintaining what they need. Like they've acquired that stiffness for a period of time for a purpose. And that needs to be respected. It's advantageous provided they have an opportunity to shift out of it, right? But the big questions that I would have and I'll come back to these once I provide a little bit of framework, is that I can't really answer those questions until I see how that person started. And what I mean by that is, from a structure standpoint, someone like you and someone like me, right? You're wider, I'm more narrow. We're going to have different inherent biases in terms of how our neuromuscular system works, but also how well we move in certain patterns. So your pec tendon is probably going to require a little bit different nourishment than my pec tendon. And we can talk about the idea of structural bias and the ideas of like compression, expansion, and all of that later on. But the big picture of that and the big takeaway is that unless I need to know how someone starts so that I can see where they've acquired these layers that have served them for powerlifting, so that we can understand how to basically keep them safe. Does that make sense? And then the other component is that I would obviously want to know setup and how the movement's executed. So yeah, like I think there's a time and place for that, and I absolutely encourage it for the most part, but there's a lot of nuance in terms of application, movement selection, how it's executed, and how it's followed. Like there's a lot here, and I don't want to overcomplicate.
What do you mean by followed? As far as the periodization over weeks or in that one session?
Potentially.
Okay.
Over weeks.
Yeah.
But also in that session, for the rest of the week, in that microcycle, where are they? And that's where it's like either the higher performer or the more jacked up someone is generally is when I have to be more on, like, get more granular with this stuff. Obviously you don't always need to. But in general, yes, I think there is something to be said for movement variability, provided it's applied at the right time with the right implement, the right degree of force, and you respect what's happening with soft tissue. Because you could think about soft tissue, something like a tendon. You could think about it almost like it's basically what I'm trying to say is it's viscoelastic, meaning it's going to have some fluid properties to it that are going to change over time, right? And so if all we do is keep that stiff, then yes, there's less pliability. However, we also want that stiffness at certain phases of the year, more than others.
Well, the question I would have then is, as you age, you're going to lose, some of that. So you'd want to be able to implement these things before that happens. Absolutely. Instead of trying to chase behind.
Right.
But if you did everything that we can see on social media, then you're going to have no time to train.
Yes. And that's where, like, honestly, people ask me, like, how did you, like, figure out, like, how you treat, how you train? Like, how did you figure that all out? And for me, it was easy. It was that I was short on time and I never wanted to not train ever. So my whole, like, I don't want to even call it a treatment model of training as rehab, is basically like, how can we be smarter to make sure that we're periodizing throughout the year appropriately and taking into as many considerations as we can, knowing that this is not a textbook, this is not a linear system, and as human beings, we're never going to have the perfect answer because there's going to be stuff going on that we can't see and can't control. That might be a biochemical process. That might be something going on in life. Who knows? But there's a lot of variability that's going to happen.
All right. So if we're looking at this as far as training blocks, right? And training blocks are going to be able to, whatever the motor abilities you're trying to develop in a training block is going to last for X number of weeks, depending upon whatever that motor ability is going to be. Absolute strength may not last as long as explosive strength or whatnot. So if you're going through a training block of this, of where the focus is more that, as a strength athlete, I call it more like a bodybuilding, training type of block.
You mean like a block that's basically almost a resilience block?
Oh, like a resilience block.
Okay.
Then how long would that stay before you're going to start to see the point of diminishing returns, to where you want the stiffness going into a meet, right? But you'd want to be able to have that resilience, hopefully get you to that 4 weeks or whatever it's going to be.
So in my opinion, and there's a graph that I show to a lot of people, and I'll even call it, like, the graph. But really what we're trying to do is, there's a certain threshold, right? And above that threshold, there's either, tissue failure or really bad pain or something. And then there's a baseline, which is like where we operate day to day. And at any given point in the year, there's going to be a massive fluctuation between, we approach that kind of painful threshold in training. And then if we're not in pain, it means we kind of come back down. And what I mean by painful threshold, again, keep in mind, pain is basically, in very simplistic terms, threat perception, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like whether it's pressure, compression, tension, any of those things, chemical, whatever. At any given point in time, we should be looking to raise that ceiling and lower the baseline that someone's operating at day to day. And I'm a big believer that everything that we do in training, life is going to bring us up towards that baseline. I'm sorry, bring us up towards that ceiling, or is going to allow us to create a bigger gap between our operating and that pain, that we'll call it that threshold.
Mm-hmm.
Our job as coaches is to always find ways to manage and exchange training principles as needed to make sure there's as big a gap as possible between their baseline and that symptomatic state. So with regards to, if we're thinking about a resilience block, I've got stuff in for my athletes all the time. And I'm sure you probably do, and you probably coach coaches to do the same. But really what we're looking at is that there's a greater influence of the training itself that's taking us up towards that symptomatic threshold than a loss of properties. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, for example, going into a meet prep, you're going to be adding a greater stimulus that would have a net effect of tipping you up towards that like not great threshold. And that's really, I think, one of the biggest differences between, powerlifting or being in like a meet prep or a peaking block than training the rest of the year. Is it's just a greater inundation of a very high power stimulus. Mm-hmm. Time spent in a position and load in that time. Probably two of the biggest factors that are going to contribute to what changes our trajectory.
Well, one thing that I've always said is whatever that meet prep time is, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever, right? Everybody's going to have different, that there's a starting gate there, to when that starts. The whole goal of the off season is to bring up weak points, but to also to get to that starting gate the healthiest you possibly can, because from that time period on, it's going to disintegrate. You're going to try your best to maintain, but in strength sports, the healthier usually always wins, especially if all things are equal. But even if all things aren't equal, normally the healthier is going to win because the other person is going to be so fucked up, they're not going to be able to display what their actual strength is. Because that is strength sports, is to be able to display your true strength on a meet day, which almost never happens, right? I mean, if it did, every max lift you did would be a PR, and it would move super slow that you couldn't put another pound on there. Either miss it or you smoke it.
God, I miss those days.
You know what I'm saying? So it's, so when we're dealing with things like, max attempts, like what does that really mean if you actually had 40 pounds left or whatever it's going to be?
Yeah.
But if somebody goes in and they're so beat up that they could squat 800, but their knees are killing them and their back is killing them, and they're only able to display 720. Well, then the person that's got a 740 top end is still going to win because they're healthier, but they're actually not as strong. So the whole key thing to going in as healthy as you can possibly can is it is a great equalizer, to those that don't, because the top person, in general, I've always kind of said that you should be able to total 10 or 15% more than you actually expect if you're totally healthy, right? Because that's just how that's just kind of how it works. The whole thing is to be able to display your best lift. And that kind of also plays in, there's technical aspects to all that too, to where if, we have an event, we're teaching people how to fix their form and all this other kind of stuff, and then they squat a 50-pound PR. They did not get 50 pounds stronger in one day. Right. So all they did was display the strength they already had in a more effective way. That's kind of all it is. But that can also play into this getting beat up throughout a period of time, because if they're technically Summer's here and so is the heat. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms, and I know most of you that are training in garage gyms, private gyms, black iron gyms, know what I'm talking about when I say the heat sucks. It kills your motivation to go to the gym, it kills your performance, but it doesn't have to if you keep your electrolytes up. That's why today's episode is sponsored by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink with everything you need and nothing you don't. This means lots of salt with none of the junk. No sugar, no colors, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. It contains an electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Element can help prevent and eliminate headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, brain fog, sleeplessness, and other common symptoms associated with electrolyte deficiency. Right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. Get yours at drinkelement.com. This deal is only available through the Table Talk link. Are you looking to boost recovery, enhance your sex drive, and improve performance in the gym? Do you think your hormones are out of whack and you're tired of getting the runaround from your doctor? You know, things like your hormones are just fine, stop lifting heavy weights, etc., etc., etc. I know what that feels like, as I've been down that road most of my life. This is why we've partnered with Merrick Health. Merrick Health is a premium telehealth platform that specializes in hormone optimization and preventative medicine, ensuring a better quality of life. Merrick Health offers a Table Talk panel tailored for our listeners, featuring comprehensive tests like total and free testosterone, sensitive estradiol, and advanced markers like lipoprotein A and IGF-1. These comprehensive panels of up to 84 carefully selected biomarkers allow you to identify areas of enhancement and maximize your physical, cognitive, and sexual performance. It's much different than the panels you may get from your doctor. Choose between self-service options where you can select lab panels based upon decades of experience, or opt for guided optimization with your own health coach. Start with a detailed breakdown of your labs and receive personalized treatment options, both over the counter and prescription. Visit merrickhealth.com/tabletalk and use the code tabletalk to get 10% off your first order. Merrick Health isn't just about better health, it's about empowering you to take control of your well-being. Not efficient, through that whole prep, they're going to accumulate more damage, right? And so with that in mind, I don't know how much different that would really be if it was in bodybuilding, because the stimulus is going to be, it's going to change. The training's different, everything's going to change, but you're in a calorie deficit. The stress is going higher, know, so the same consideration should still come into play, that when you start the prep, everything should be as healthy as it possibly can be, blood work included, to be able to get the best outcome. And the crappy part about all that is it leads to this framework of lifters, clients, whatever you want to call it, that don't approach the off season the way that they actually should, because the off season actually is more important for development and growth and becoming better at the sport than losing all the fat from the muscle that you have before a show, or trying to peak the strength, for that. But what I typically see is people will gravitate toward a coach when they're ready to start prepping for something, where I would think that the opposite should be the case.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. And like, just from a planning perspective, I think one thing that people could do a lot better is actually expose themselves a little bit more to, I'll back up a little bit. So in my world, in terms of getting people really healthy and really freaking strong, because everyone wants to be strong and everyone wants to be jacked, like that's what I do. That is what I need to give people. In order for me to do that, I need to also simultaneously expose them to the very thing that may be the weak link. And what I mean by that is not the same type of weak link that we think of in terms of like a mini max and a floor press, right? What I mean by that is whatever influence is driving the system's durability down. In my world, that typically means a barbell. Barbell is really hard on us. We're asymmetrical beings, and we put a very heavy symmetrical object within us. There's going to create some issues there, right? And I think we can kind of inherently see that. But if we never, and this I think will kind of circle back to some of the things you were talking about earlier with regards to like, when do we do the thing we're not supposed to do? But if all we do is work around that, and we never actually build that capacity in a way that still hits the prerequisite components, we're going to be, moving in circles. So just for example, I think of someone I'm working with right now. So I've got a guy I'm working with right now who's had really, really severe knee pain for a couple years. And his training right now is just based on assessment. One of the issues that he has is he can't actually expand his rib cage to brace well. And so after years of low bar back squatting, where that bar has shoved him forward and changed the shape of all this, if he can't expand back here, he's not going to be able to create the shape change necessary to really dome his diaphragm down and manage fluid pressure as needed. So it's not that his hips are the problem. Maybe they are. Like based on range of motion testing, sure, his hips look stiff, but what's contributing to that stiffness is some of the shape change that happened further up. So I need to find a stimulus that's going to challenge some of the buoyancy effect of the upper rib cage. One of the ways that I can start him on that might be something like, if you've gotten under a heavy hack, you know how compressive that can feel here, right? Now people think knee pain and they're like, oh man, don't hack squat. That's going to hurt worse. I disagree, because if you've got the right coach behind you, we're going to work a little magic and make sure you can still train hard and not have that perception of effort. But how we go about doing that might offload that very area. So something like, if we think about something like a reverse band versus squatting against band, right? Now, if the limiting component is not hip or force production, but the shape change that occurs through here in the upper back and upper rib cage, could I not potentially use a reverse band to offload some of that and then work on gradually reducing the tension of the reverse band and then progress that by having them do the hack squat against band, so they're having to maintain that shape as they press against the band? Do you see where I'm going with that? So at some point you have to expose them to the very thing that drives their pattern, but it has to be done in a way where other constraints based on their availability of range of motion, their motor control, where they are with volume tolerance, where they are with recovery tolerance, all those have to be spoken to. Once you have those constraints spoken to, then you got to go to like the kid at the back of the room and says like, hey, come on, man, like, let's get you up to speed. Let's get you on the field.
Now, in that case, when you're doing that, would you remove the stimulus, the squat that's creating that issue?
Well, that's the thing, is like, I'm actually poking the bear with this issue by putting him in a hack squat, which is highly compressive in the first and second ribs, but kind of third too. So it's just a different application. So someone who's got knee pain, back squatting, sometimes removing the thing, like they think it's their back, they think the squat pattern is what hurts their knees. Well, if I can get them in a squat pattern, even if it's not a barbell, but they're working really hard and we're using modifiers that, quite frankly, most of my guys don't know, that I'm like, okay, well, we need to get your hips to yield so that you can have your pelvic floor ascend, and like, I don't care about that stuff. They just want to have the perception of effort and training. My responsibility as a coach to make sure that we're keeping in what's important. Again, value perception. What do they value? They value hard training. They value not hurting. How can I do that while bringing up the very thing that they might be missing? Does that make sense? So I think it's really important, especially when it comes to longevity and in strength sports and things like that. I think it's important to keep in some exposure to some of the very patterns that may drive our pain. And I got to be honest, most times what people think is their pain isn't actually their pain. They think it's their knee. It's not their knee. They think it's their hip. Maybe it's their hip, but probably not. Does that make sense?
Where do you typically see those issues fall?
I see a lot of it start with poor movement selection, poor execution, and a poor understanding of their structural bias. And I keep coming back to that term because, man, Dave, like, I am so tired of getting on social media and talking to people who are like, oh, I did a corrective exercise and it didn't help. We need it. Like, we as athletes, desperately need a new lens and system to see this by. And the problem is we're putting performance measures, like everyone's low bar back squatting if you're in powerlifting, right? And we need that. That's part of the sport, on bodies that are built very differently. And a lot of this is going to come from, model. I don't know if you know who Bill Hartman is. Really brilliant guy, but a lot of the problems with some of these models is they talk a lot about, the breathing drills and see like that and things like that you see on Instagram. Again, like, that I come from, like, I did that series with Casey back in 2015. A lot I would do differently about that now. But they don't apply it in a way that is relevant to us because we have such a unique set of problems and a unique set of constraints. Within that, as people are built differently, they're going to be inherently better at squatting or hinging, usually at baseline with where they start before we have added on the layers of muscle, before we've added on the layers of neurological training to get everything as tight as possible. And so that's kind of where earlier I was talking about, like, before I start talking about what movement someone should be doing for, to build in that resiliency, I need to know their structure. And inherently we know this. If you look at someone like Dave, my husband, he's wide. He can handle load, right? Like, his problem is not necessarily like putting force into like he's good at handling that. Versus someone like me, my structure, my rib cage, all the angle of everything between my collarbones, my whole axial skeleton is relatively narrow. I tend to be a more compressed individual. So for me, there's constant kind of squeezing going on through the neuromuscular system. So we add more and more and more force on top of that, and more superficial musculature on top of that. It's generally going to have more problems than someone like Dave, who, in terms of like pain, than someone like Dave, who can handle a lot more of that. And so where I intercept people, and I think where we can do a better job as coaches, and where we need to have a more intellectually honest approach to how we program for people, isn't just saying, well, someone has a problem with a squat pattern, let me just give them a split squat. Because if we're not taking time to understand the way that they're structured, and again, like a certain type of pelvis and a certain type of rib cage and how those interplay, they're going to be better at certain squat patterns, or should. And if they're not, well, then they're deficit. Things like that. So we need a system to assess that. And then we need a system to kind of say, okay, well, here's what the rehab, these are all the breathing drills people do. How do I take that into training? And that's, I think, where we as a group are so underserved, because the model just says, well, if it hurts, don't do it. We have to get better at that. This is what I'm making my whole course about, is like, you can tell I'm getting bothered by the fact that we can't be intellectually honest enough to actually to look at the fact that we as people are fluid, and we have to manage that fluid, and that your shape is different than my shape. Back in the 1800s, they were good at describing the stout, stocky versus the slender, narrow. This is not a new concept. And yet we don't actually think that maybe there's some credibility to it. Does that make sense? So basically, when it comes to kind of exposing those patterns and being smart with how we expose our athletes to those patterns, we need to recognize that a certain stress is going to have a different effect on one system versus another. Someone who is a little bit wider may tolerate a low bar back squat and the associated shape changes that come with that better than someone who's narrow and already squeezed everywhere and now has nowhere left to squeeze. That's the state I'm in. And so we have to periodize that differently. And we have to think about addressing these constraints differently, and recognize that a squat pattern, just because it's a hack squat or a back squat or a front squat or whatever, they're not going to have the same effect on the system. And I'm really doing a poor job of communicating what I'm trying to get across here.
Well, the question I would have on that, and it may help you to describe this a little bit better, is if somebody does this for a long period of time, say a decade, are they not going to be able to fall into their bias patterns because they're going to be better at it? They're not going to hurt as much at that. So squat stance would be a good example. The way they deadlift would be a good example, to where eventually over a period of time, they're going to fall into where they're stronger, where their stance feels better. Even it's going to take time, right? Because a lot of people may tell them, look, you need to be way wider, but not understand what you're talking about.
So I think you're hitting on a couple different things there. So one is where we're actually strongest for performance, right? That's a very different. So our structural bias, meaning like our skeleton, just how we're put together, is going to play a role in how we feel most powerful and moving the bar. And I think that's kind of what you're hitting.
Yeah.
Now, if we hit that over and over and over again, just because our body is put together a certain way, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're layering into adaptations that we're good at. Because you take someone who is really good at a certain pattern and then load it many, many, many times. And depending on that, and there's a lot of nuance here, depending on what that person's starting point is, if they don't ever have the opportunity to alternate out of that and create that reciprocity, that's where problems happen. So it's someone who, again, I'll just use myself as an example. Structurally, I'm not put together for powerlifting. Now, I created more and more layers of squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and stiffness and stiffness and stiffness. That's part of why my adductor tendon ruptured. But now trying to figure out any sort of expansion, I've gotten so compressed in so many places that to try to open that up it should require such low effort because that muscle is so tight anyway. Oh gosh, I'm getting into a lot of things here. Basically, where I would take this is that there's a very big difference between where we're going to be strongest moving a bar, and there are going to be exchanges, positive and negative, as we use how we're already put together. Does that make more sense? So one of the biggest things that I see change right off the bat is, and we see this with pain often, is the loss of, especially in powerlifting, is the loss of what I'm going to call relative motion. And we do what's called orient our whole body. The idea of relative motion is, it's as simple as arthrokinematics, meaning the bones need to be able to move on each other, right? But as we go through certain patterns, whether it's a squat pattern or a press or an overhead movement, what should happen is there should be a fluctuation or a change in the bias of rotation between those bones. The stiffer we get and the more load we apply in a system, the more superficial musculature we get involved, it kind of becomes, again, like our baseline, the less relative motion we have because we've trained for it. I mean, think about it. You get under a bar and you're asking your body to be as stiff as possible. Over time, that loss of relative motion is generally where I see people have a lot of pain, especially in coming from, it doesn't matter if it's bodybuilding or powerlifting. To me, load is load. More load, obviously, yeah. And a bilateral movement, obviously, yeah. But again, like I work with a lot of guys under their 30s and 40s and are like, man, I felt great 5 years ago. I was getting really strong. And now all of a sudden I'm super immobile. Feel like I can't play with my kids. And that feeling of that stiffness, like almost walking like a tin man, that's a loss of relative motion. That will happen more and more as we access more of our inherent bias. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That was a lot of words. So if it doesn't make sense, let me know.
I get that. So how do you go about, because some of it's necessary, some of it's not.
Right.
You know, so how do you go about balancing that?
And I think that's where the periodization comes in. I mean, to me, if I've got someone who's getting ready for the platform, they don't need relative. They only need as much relative motion as they need to hit depth. That's really it. And at the shoulder to be able to bench. But throughout the rest of the year, again, if we stay in that state, generally, I'll back up one more time. What I mean by orientation is if you take the whole pelvis and you just shove the whole thing forward, that's different than being able to kind of, move it backwards and forwards or find true kind of hip internal rotation. Does that make sense? I totally lost my thought.
Well, it's with the periodization of trying to balance out the stiffness without the stiffness.
So and I would even say this depends on gender a little bit, because I tend to see that my women that compete do better if we remove the orientation bias and recapture a little relative motion, but you really only want as much as you need for the meet, right? Throughout the rest of the year, I'm going to back up one more layer. And if I didn't think this was important, I would keep going with this. As we move through our squat, our bench, most of life, basically, there are so many more degrees of rotation that we don't appreciate. We're taught muscles are levers and pulleys. They're not. You know, we even come back to like, what do we learn in school? We learn sliding filament theory, which is a very linear based theory. And I think that kind of lends itself to a very linear based training pattern. But even now, you know, I think more research is coming out about the role of, I think it's Titan, as kind of a structural stabilizer that supports more of a helical nature of our muscle fibers. We inherently, as people, are more helical nature. There's more compression expansion. We're 99% water. And what does water do? Well, 99% by mass, not by volume. I think 70% by volume. But what does water do? It flows. It changes shape, right? Like it's not this. But when we're taught to look at anatomy, like we look at a 2D textbook, or we go to a cadaver, this is a really grotesque analogy, so sorry in advance, but it's kind of like looking at beef jerky versus looking at steak. And I hope that gives a really good representation of the fact that, like, if you take some meat, there's a lot of like movement within that. There's a lot of rotation. Every single one of our movements demands rotation. So basically, where I'm going with this is, as we go through a squat, different degrees of relative motion of IR and ER are requisite depending on the range of motion in the squat, depending on the start position, because a pelvis that's jammed forward is going to be sitting in a different position of relative femoral movement in the hip joint than a pelvis that's not super just jammed forward. I don't want to say neutral because I hate that term. So if someone's starting in a position of a certain rotation and then they require degrees of it throughout the movement, if they don't have that, that's where problems happen. Does that make sense? So there are two different things there. There's the idea of relative motion and the idea of orientation. When it comes to periodization, depending on the person and their training history, like someone like you, I don't know that I could pick up a whole ton of relative motion. Maybe, right? But your nervous system's pretty acclimated to where it is. Your structures, your tendons, your soft tissue is all stiffened to that degree. For someone who, you know, is maybe early 30s, late 40s, even just doing some sort of rotational drills throughout the year, like if I had to pick one low-hanging fruit to give listeners, do some sort of rotation. Anything. You know, whether that's, gosh, like a rotating plank if we're talking super low-hanging fruit, or, you know, some sort of a chop or a lift, provided, again, it's coming from the right place, that's probably a good place to start. As you come into your training as you come into a peaking cycle, it's going to be less about creating relative motion and maybe a little bit more about resisting it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So again, I know that was a lot, and none of that was probably super new to you. But again, like my hope for listeners is that there's a different way to be thinking about things. And just because you've looked at a 2D anatomy chart your whole life, and because you've gone to a doctor and you've seen that chart on the wall of the muscles and there it's very like, this is a line, that is not the angle of pennation of our fibers in vivo. Like that's not what they look like. Yeah. Well, so
a lot of the things that you're saying, they're not that complicated and it's not that hard to implement. And on the back end of that, you spend 40 years doing this and then you try to implement it, you're kind of screwed.
Exactly.
Right. So there's not a lot of ground you're going to really gain, you know, while if it was implemented throughout the whole process, it's not going to be detrimental in any way. It's not going to take that much time. And if it's phasically structured, it's going to take even less time because it's only going to be really during certain phases, then you're going to maintain it during other phases. So we keep coming back to having some type of phasic structure, you know, and even, you know, for, you know, the conjugate folks that to me really don't understand conjugate because it still is, there's a phasic structure behind the whole thing as well. Yeah. You know, it can be all implemented in there, you know, so a lot of the conjugate people are going to say, no, we're just doing everything all the time. And my pushback on that is that's impossible to do at a high level ever, you know, so there inherently is this change, you know, if they're conscious, you know, of what needs to be implemented in there, you know, to where, you know, if it's rotational stuff and it's post meet, you know, is the sled more important than the rotational stuff, you know, so that becomes probably not, you know, so, and both can be implemented. There's things they could pull out that during that time period could be replaced with something that's going to inherently be better for them, not only long term, but I would also argue short term, right? Because as you're starting to peak for any strength thing, it becomes anti-rotation, right? Where you don't want to be locked into permanent anti-rotation because that's going to create issues.
Right. I think more what I'm trying to hit on, and I probably should have found a way to say this earlier, is that whether or not you realize that you are rotating, you are. You have to rotate in your hips to get into your squat.
Yeah.
The pelvis has to be able to.
Yeah.
No, and I don't mean like, are you familiar with like the hip flexion arc? Okay. So I think what a lot of people forget is that we can bias and create certain portions of that at different times. For example, elevating a heel or elevating the front foot is going to bias a different degree of rotation at a different point. Now, depending on your particular orientation and presentation, one of those is going to be more appropriate than the other. So when it comes to phasic training, especially as you get more stiff up here, it's going to become more and more important to maintain and find a way to get what you can through the hips. Even if it's like, this is one of those things that other PTs might kind of slay me for, but even if it's like not healthy, for example, someone is a geared squatter and they're going to be in a massive anterior orientation through the rib cage, pelvis, neck, all of it. They're going to have to be able to maintain. They're basically going to have to learn to find hip rotation in that pattern. So let's say in their table tests, right? Like this is where we can sort of get like, whatever. Let's say in their table tests, very realistic numbers for a power lifter. Maybe they've got 15 degrees of internal rotation and 20 degrees of external. That's really bad. Like the hip should have an arc of motion of about 70 degrees. So when you're looking at about 40 degrees of total hip rotation, that's not a lot. Okay. And then we're going to throw them into a bias that takes away, that's like trying to help them create more rotation and put force on the floor, right? So we've taken a short window and now we've shortened it more and skewed it. And I'm sitting here saying, well, you're living that window. You better figure out where you're going to borrow motion from. And it's probably going to be your back, but you better figure out how to do that for the meet. And then after the meet, you need to figure out how to broaden that window. Does that make more sense?
Yeah.
So, I mean, let's say someone doesn't have hip IR or ER, right? Either one, it doesn't matter. I might put them in a position that even if they don't have it and asks for it, demands their body find some sort of a change. Now, it can't be loaded super heavy, right? There's a strategy we can take with that. The other strategy is that we look to find that motion. And that's really going to depend on the athlete and the lifter. And I don't think, I mean, personally, for ancillaries, for me, when it comes down to like keeping someone healthy, I don't write them in training blocks. Their main movements are going to have training blocks, sure. But how their body responds to a heavy movement, like how someone, let's say we're really pushing a safety bar squat versus a low bar squat. Those are going to have different influences. So when it comes to periodizing, I need to feed into that, or I need to basically make decisions in light of that. And that's where I'm going to bias different positions, whether it's a heel elevation or gosh, you're going to get rotation of the shoulder anytime you're doing an overhead, pulling patterns, rowing patterns. So I think the crux of the issue doesn't necessarily come down to like, to me, the way that I go about doing things is I know their body is going to adapt some not great patterns from their training, right? Someone once told me, they're like, you're the PT that I go to when I know that what I'm going to do is going to be jacked up and you're going to help walk me out of the woods and still let me train. I'm like, that's pretty close. So knowing that we're going to start to develop these stiffness and poor mobility patterns, ancillary movements that we think of as like, piddly, push those and bias them. If you're training a movement that's going to decrease your hip interrotation is your main movement, choose a movement that demands you have IR. Make sure you're doing it well and like test yourself. Like don't just randomly hope you're, recapturing IR, but test yourself. Load that puppy because you're going to have to be able to calibrate and recalibrate and basically sustain some sort of baseline to accommodate for everything that you're putting on your system that's going to take away motion. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if I'm understanding you correctly, if I'm looking, or if somebody's looking at a training day and post warm up, they have that main movement, right? So one may look at that secondary movement or the accessory movements as here's that main movement. Now I'm going to put in the movements to be able to make that main movement stronger. You're looking at that main movement, but then the secondary and other accessory movements are to create the function of what that main movement bias created to be able to balance, I guess, for lack of a better word.
It depends. And hearing you say that, I'm like, okay, yeah, that is basically what I said, but I'm trying to figure out how to communicate the nuance of that. So generally a healthy nervous system, or a nervous system that's getting really good joint input, is going to have the highest force production, right? Like we've all gotten to that point where we know we're stiff and we're like, man, my joints just feel like crap. I can't move well. I'm not strong right now. I do think that the best afferent input we can get to the brain during our training is generally going to have a better output in our main movement anyway, better strength expression. And what I'm saying with the ancillaries is that to a degree, yes, what you said with like, yeah, we're going to use that to maintain function. But it's more than just it's more than just load. And it's more than just movement selection. We want to look at certain properties that are going to happen with the connective tissue, such as being able to yield. So great example. Someone I had was getting ready for a meet, and I used a reverse band hack squat to maintain his ability to not have his whole posterior pelvis just shove him forward. He had to be able to yield into that. So it's not necessarily function from the standpoint of like, oh, like mobility and just rotation. There's a lot that goes into this. And now I'm also choosing that particular squat pattern, not only because of the neuromuscular properties and some of the yielding that I was just talking about, but also because of the range of motion. And for him, I'm going to choose to either reverse band or go against band, depending on what I look at with his upper rib cage. So it's not that this movement is easy. Like this movement is still, he trained to failure in this movement.
Yeah.
And it really, I know you're trying to.
Well, you're looking at weak points a little differently and more in depth than what the average coach is going to look at that weak point. Right. So they're going to look at that and say, well, bench stalls halfway. So secondary movement's going to be, So that's kind of where I'm going there, where if you dig a little bit deeper, then you're looking into all the nuance associated with that, which could be, the eccentric strength. It could be, the yielding. It could be a lot of different things that will be exposed. So the question would be, how often do you have to see that being exposed before that becomes something to be addressed? Or is it inherently always going to be exposed based upon their structure?
I'd say somewhere in between. So we know that someone's structure is this thing, right? Like this is how they were born. This is how their skeleton's put together. This is where muscle attachments are. Okay, then we layer on training, right? That's superimposed on top of their structure, right? So we've superimposed that. And now we're superimposing constraints from movements on top of that. So we've got their structure, and then we've got their training adaptations that probably reduce range of motion, things like that. And now we're further changing available range of motion by putting their body in a certain position. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So how often do I expose that? How often do I change that? Is that kind of what you're asking? Or do we just assume that's going to be there? I think a lot of that depends on where they're at. So I typically don't write out like a training block for people, because what I tend to see is that the longer someone trains, so I've got like a main movement and a mechanically similar movement, right? It doesn't matter if they're powerlifting or bodybuilding, you got to get stronger. What I tend to see is how quickly that main movement and mechanically similar movement progress. Half the time I'm like, okay, this could go one of two ways. And I have no idea how it's going to go in terms of what their body does with that. My job is to adjust and kind of fine tune that barometer. So I know, like, we can predict with some reliability what certain movements are going to do to someone's body. We can predict with certain reliability that a low bar back squat is going to create a lot of compression in the backside of the rib cage. It's going to create a lot of concentric orientation, posterior musculature. We can know that, right? What happens next? Good question. And I think that's where, as a coach, like, it's kind of like playing golf. You can plan your second shot, but you got to see where your first shot lands first. And a great coach is going to be able to pivot those things as needed. It's just like a contest prep coach. The contest prep coach isn't going to say, okay, do this for just one meal. Do whatever you want the rest of the day. They need to be able to know and pivot based on how things adjust. Does that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, now let me flip this completely on its head.
Okay.
Right. And say that, and it's highly unlikely, somebody that's listening to this has never trained at all. They could listen to this and say, screw all this. I don't want to train because all it's going to do is mess me up.
Hurt.
Right. Right. So now from that physical therapy standpoint, you know, how do you take the resistance training, or let's just say training in general, and then apply that, you know, to them in a general sense?
Yeah. So this is actually a really good question, because I do have people that approach me and say, hey, like, I don't want to be super jacked and strong. Like, I just want to lift and not hurt. And you seem like you know what you're doing. I'm like, wow, I'm good at pretending.
Yeah. Well, it's so easy to get super jacked and strong too. But I get,
obviously,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah, I get
it's not
what
like
you're
I
saying.
gave myself seizures trying to maintain muscle mass. I do get a lot of those. And I think that's where, again, it's really, really important to be able to understand, okay, so what makes a movement a good movement for someone, right? And what's a good movement for you might not be a good movement for me. What's a great movement for my husband is a terrible movement for me. And so having a way to kind of assess, and also having clear communication up front about, you know, what to expect. Like, every coach should be able to, one of the biggest tools we give people is our education, right? Like, we want to educate them. But I think one of the biggest things that we can do is kind of assess, based on your structure, what's a good movement, what's a bad movement, or not bad, but like, what movement is going to create a greater exchange of quality of life to strength. Maybe that's a good way to look at it, because everything we do is going to create some sort of exchange. It might be big, it might be small. The longer you train under heavy weights, obviously that's a large exchange. Training heavy and training hard without the extreme is still an exchange, but a smaller one. And in my opinion, much easier to manage, provided communication's on point. So I have a lot of people that I work with that maybe they've lifted, 5-6 years, and they're kind of tired of writing their own program, but they don't really know. I'm starting to get kind of achy. Like, something here just doesn't feel like it used to.
Well, more of a real case scenario, I suppose, would be, somebody that's listening that has a significant other, or, a teenage kid that wants to start training. Right. So typical scenario is they're just going to have them do whatever they do.
Yeah.
Right. So So what would that look like? I mean, what should that look like?
I think a lot of people are pretty intuitive, and I think we've over-scienced a lot of this. And in general, I think someone knows if they're better at squatting or they're better at a deadlift type motion. And I don't want to say just go with your gut, but I do think that a lot of people are inherently, even if they've not been an athlete, if you give them a kettlebell and you have them goblet squat, or you give them, a trap bar and you have them deadlift, they're going to say, okay, one of these feels a little better than the other. Cool. If you give them a barbell for a bench press, or put them in an overhead machine press, they're going to say one of these feels better. Okay, cool. Right now, those are two extremes. If I were to think about pressing patterns, we've got overhead and we've got like a bench. And, lower body, we've got a squat or a hinge, things like that. We could even go into rowing movements, overhead versus, horizontal row. And think about those as two ends of the spectrum, right? So when we think about inherent bias, like I talk a lot about a wide versus a narrow, those are also two ends of the spectrum. There's so many things in between. All that does is provide us a frame of reference to go, okay, most people are going to be somewhere in between here. So if we take that and we then kind of apply those to those movements, I think most people are going to have a better idea of, I feel pretty okay with both, but I think I like squatting a little bit more. I feel pretty okay with both, but I think I like overhead a little bit more. It just feels better. That's kind of where we see some of the structural bias come in. Does that...
With your background in powerlifting and then bodybuilding and the physical therapy, and you've trained in gyms with intermediate to pro. And when you look around, what are some of the things that you see could be done better? I'm trying to frame the question in a positive way.
No, this is a really good question. Honestly, I think intermediate lifters, they think way too much. They think too much about doing it right. They're so afraid of doing something wrong. This is something that Chris and I talk about all the time. As big as social media has become, it's a great resource, but can also be really paralyzing for people. And what happens is you get you get people who are maybe very vocal about their opinions, saying this is the only way to do it based on their structure. This is the way you row. If you're not doing it this way, you're wrong. And I think that intermediate lifters are so afraid of doing something wrong, they kind of forget how to train themselves. And they forget how to learn what works for them and what feels good for them. And sometimes you have to have that bad rep to go, oh, that felt bad. I don't want to do that again. Or I don't think that's how that's supposed to be. So I think that is one of the biggest mistakes that people make, is trying to do right for someone who's not even watching them. And I think if you can actually, again, like, just gain a little altitude, breathe for a second. If you're a novice or an intermediate lifter, you got a lot of figuring out to do. And more than that, as you add more mass, it's going to change what's right for right now. And this goes for everyone, whether you're very experienced or not. What's right for right now is not going to be right for always. You might find that for one reason or another right now, a step forward dumbbell row where you're really getting your forefoot into the floor and getting a full reach across your body feels great. You might feel that, 6 months from now, a staggered stance feels better. And that's going to be a reflection of a lot of things that are changing, right? But I think people are so concerned about doing something wrong that, again, let's come back to that 80% of people moving away from what doesn't feel good.
Yeah, I do believe that's a detriment for a couple reasons. One of the bigger reasons is if they're younger, they can get away with making way more mistakes than if they're older.
True. And
recover from it. And if they get hurt, whatever, they're out for a day. It's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
So they have this window of opportunity to where if they wanted, they could probably train 4 hours a day and go to failure on everything and still be, not saying that that's right, but they can do all that to be able to expedite the process of figuring out what feels best for them, mind muscle connection, whole other things that we put in there, to where if it's so dialed in, for lack of a better word, during that time period, those later time periods when they are stronger, they have more muscle mass, they don't have that same window of opportunity to play around with different shit.
Yeah.
So they're long-term hurting themselves, from that. The crazy thing about all that is, if the lifter doesn't mature mentally over that same time period, when they're older, they're going to think, well, the reason I'm not making progress is because I used to do this.
Right.
Then they try to do that, and then they're just screwed up beyond belief.
Yeah.
Like I used to train way harder, and maybe, by definition, maybe, but if we're to calculate in the weight and the workload and the stress on the body between, a 20-pound dumbbell press and a 150-pound dumbbell press, there's a big difference.
Absolutely. I think people it would be good for people to really adopt a phrase someone gave me. It's very, very simple. It's going to be different. It's really, really simple, right? But that can hit pretty hard when you actually internalize that. I think that one of the biggest mistakes I see, not mistakes, one of the biggest things I see kind of more advanced lifters make is just what you hit on, that they're so stuck in their pattern and their way of doing things. And honestly, by the time they talk to me, usually their way of doing things is walking 20 miles into the woods. You want to walk another 20 miles into the woods, or do you want to walk out of the woods? And this is simple, right? This could be simple things like the way you're executing a pull down, or it might be how you're approaching training in general. And I think what's hard is there's a lot of cognitive dissonance where people think they want to do something differently. People think they want to do something differently. And when you gently challenge them on that, there's a lot of pushback. And it's hard. And I think, and you can probably speak to this as a coach as well, it's like you gotta think about, okay, well, how do I talk to this person to help them, knowing that the problem is probably their perception of inability to let go.
Yeah, it's multifaceted, because in one regard, they know more than they think they do, right? Because they've already figured a lot of things out. So you don't want to, they shouldn't abandon the things that they've already worked out, but they have these blind spots.
Yeah.
To where they're not able to dissect what exactly was working and then what's not, and that's where a good coach can kind of come in and say, this is all good. This is probably can be more optimized.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of times that's inverse to what the actual lifter thinks.
Yes.
You know, and that's that cognitive dissonance that you're talking about. It's like your gains actually were all coming from, actually all of it, because it's all systemic, right? But the majority was coming from here, not from here.
Yeah.
Right. So these are the things that have to change. Like, oh, I can't do that. You know, that's my bread and butter.
Yeah.
Well, your bread and butter is why you're fucked up.
Yeah. it's cool. Keep talking about Tate, my husband, but what's been really cool about watching him train is he's so receptive to my feedback. And I think that the conversations that he and I have, I wish he was here because he does such a good job of helping me clarify. And he has such a unique insight in terms of how some of these things really come into training. And one of the things that we've really looked at with him with regards to changing things is he and I both, like, we love to deadlift. That's our thing. But the more he's tried to hammer his quads to bring up size, you know, and hitting really heavy hack squats, obviously, like, hack squats sometimes cause some knee pain. And so it was a question of, okay, well, what are the other things going on that might be contributing to your knee pain? And he had me take a look at everything he was doing. And I said, dude, I don't think your leg day is the problem. It's all the other stuff that's coming up during the week that's changing the bias coming into that day. So for him, being really back dominant through pelvis in different position, decreased hip rotation, blah, blah, blah. So he kind of said, okay, so should I not deadlift right now? And I said, I mean, maybe. Is there a different variation that you can do that's not quite so back dominant? Maybe it's how you're doing it. So we changed him from deficit deficit stiff legs to a rack pull the way that John used to do them. You know, really heavy lat engagement, like bringing up some thickness there. Because otherwise, the way that Dave pulls, he's just locked in everywhere. Mm-hmm. Everything is locked in the way it should be for powerlifting. But his body held on to that and restricted movement elsewhere. And that carried over into leg day.
So if you were to take what you know now from bodybuilding and the years of working with people and go back and compete again in powerlifting, what would you do differently?
I'd actually do some mobility work for one. Again, my models evolved out of a need that I didn't have time to do everything I needed to do, and I never wanted to come in the exchange of training. And I think the biggest change I would make isn't necessarily one with training. It's one from a mindset perspective, is I needed to not allow that to become my identity. Because when I held on to it so fragilely, or fragilely, it's a word, right?
It is now.
Oh, sweet. I love it. It's almost as good as the dad jokes.
Oh, we need to get back to that.
I think just being willing to step away from the barbell and explore things a little more. Honestly, I did one more meet in 21, somewhere in there. After tearing the adductor tendon, it was after my first really big seizure episode, and it was kind of one of those things where I was like, man, if I come back from this, like, that'd be awesome. I ended up a better Rolex, a better total. I PR'd everything. I was stronger than I've been. I was leaner than I've been. And what I did differently, honestly, was just the way that I train now. And even now, if I were going to go back squat, I mean, not right in current state, but if I were like training like normally, if I were to back squat, bench, or deadlift, I'm stronger now than I've ever been. And the bodybuilding work has only aided that in a tremendous degree. And I'm not even talking about like, oh, I sat there with like perfect form on my bodybuilding work. Like, part of why I don't post my own training is because my sets aren't pretty. Like, I'm not a pretty lifter. So that's definitely something that I would incorporate. I think a lot of that has to do with some of the afferent information in the brain stuff I was talking about, just better output there. I think a lot of that has to do with integrity of the joint. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm not locked into a bilateral movement that's heavy on a human being that's asymmetrical, because we all are. And I think some of it is I just had more fun training that way. And I think just having fun in training is really important. When you forget how to do that, it really does start to feel like a chore. Man, I really feel for people who are there, because I've been there. So.
Now, when you say that you're not a pretty lifter, or what, define that for me.
You know those people whose sets are just like perfect?
Yeah.
Like, their lines are perfect. Their execution is perfect. There are a lot of things that go into that. And it's not just intent. Intent is part of it. But you can have the best of intent. And if your body is just biased into a lot of other things from years of poor training, I mean, you can work with what you got. It's what you can do. And I didn't take care of myself the years I was powerlifting. I mean, the first 5-6 years of my training was all about proving to myself that I could unrack a heavy bar, sit down and stand back up with it, or pick something up off the floor. It wasn't about taking care of myself at all. I was in a really bad place mentally throughout really that whole time. And I think that dramatically changed how I approach training. And now, 13, 14 years into this, I'm feeling the effects of that.
What are some of the trends that you see? Because the whole physical therapy thing is kind of an interesting thing for me, because it seems that anybody that's a coach, it doesn't matter if they're physical therapy or not, they'll begin to learn physical therapy words. Then they start using the physical therapy words, and then that will spawn certain trends that kind of come along. Usually it's a specific exercise that will trend for a while. Then it will be the next one. Then it will be the next one. Then
it's a little carousel.
After a while, it's kind of like, well, wasn't that first one, going back years, like a plank or whatever, wasn't that like the best thing everybody should do? And then it gets replaced with one arm cable row or whatever that next thing's going to be. So I know you see these trends, right? And I do believe most of them probably start from a good place. Somebody who's intelligent posting whatever it's going to be, then it just gets lambasted by all the idiots that don't understand why it was being done in the first place.
Yeah, context is important.
Yes. Are you able to, at this point, predict what the next ones are going to be?
Kind of. And I think you can too. So the cool thing about this is that basically what we see is that the exercises have an effect on our body. So let's say you do one movement. It has a prolonged effect over time, right? Well, then you need a different movement that feels really good, right? And that one's going to have a different prolonged effect over time. Well, then that one kind of starts to feel not so great. And you kind of feel like maybe you need something different that's going to help your hips feel a little bit better a different way. So you try a different thing. And what we see is that we basically go in this circle of right now everyone's like, oh, you got to have hip anterior rotation. You can't have anterior rotation, posterior rib cage expansion. And I think the next thing is going to be make sure you can actually expand the front side of your rib cage, and also external rotation is important. And it's a product of it's a product of acknowledging one end of a pendulum, right? And what we see is just that pendulum swing from point to point to point, not seeing all the other things in between, and not just in the form of context, but just knowing that every movement we do is going to have an effect on the body. And again, the solution for right now is not going to be the solution for tomorrow or the next day. And people get hung up on their one solution.
Yes. Or as they would define a corrective exercise.
Oh God. Sorry, the physical therapist just died.
I know. It's
correctives.
So to go down that, that's always been interesting to me, because corrective for whom, right? And then what are you actually trying to correct? And can an exercise actually do that?
I'm going to broaden this a little bit.
Yeah.
Because
what needs broadened?
Okay. Glad we're on that page together. So when I hear corrective exercise, to me, that's like someone's talking about a totally different box of movement. It's like, oh, it's not movement. It's this special thing, right? And that kind of brings me back to this idea of we have this pendulum of training and rehab, and rehab is a different thing than training. And those are two ends of a pendulum. And rather than a box, right, we could view that as a pendulum that has, or some sort of a scale that has a color gradient. But honestly, I usually use that in my Swiss talk. And the caveat I would give to that is that is wrong too. Or in my opinion, there's a better way to say things or to see things. And that's a very simplified version of saying basically that there's a movement that has a purpose, and the purpose is going to be more restorative or to address a deficit than it is to pursue performance. But if that deficit is prohibiting performance, are we not just wanting to see the whole system perform better? So when we think about correctives, yeah, they can create some crazy changes, right? And I've seen it. You've probably seen it too. You've been in more seminars than I have. Gosh. I think the problem is that I'm going to zoom out again and think about traditional rehab, better rehab, and kind of best corrective rehab. Traditional rehab, you do some like, external rotations, or you do some like, I freaking hate when people lay on the floor and just like lift their foot like they think they're recapturing hip internal rotation. That's not doing what it's not doing what you think it is doing. But okay. Right. So that's like normal, like rehab, right? And then we have better rehab, which is where we start to go, oh, okay, maybe someone should like, do a squat pattern, or like, maybe they should back squat as part of their rehab, right? That's okay. But then like true rehab is like, there's a perception of effort. There's a perception of intensity. There's periodization. You're looking at multiple energy systems, because if you're not having energy systems that can keep up with the demand that you're trying to train, the problem is never going to be the muscle. The problem is going to be what can you get to that muscle to supply it so that it can continue to do what it needs to do. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that where people really kind of fall short is they'll spend time doing some sort of prehab or like, corrective exercise at the start of a session, and there's still too much delineation between their warm-ups and their actual training. And in the context of powerlifting, I don't want that to be heard as like the warm-ups on the bar. I want that to be heard as, if you're doing something within your warm-ups to, I don't know, facilitate better hip rotation or better core activation or whatever, there's more to it than simply trying to also do that same thing with your session, right? The session structure itself, to me, is the rehab. Maybe not the rehab, but it's like one of the biggest players that we have.
Summer's here and so is the heat. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms, and I know most of you that are training in garage gyms, private gyms, black iron gyms, know what I'm talking about when I say the heat sucks. It kills your motivation to go to the gym, it kills your performance, but it doesn't have to if you keep your electrolytes up. That's why today's episode is sponsored by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink with everything you need and nothing you don't. This means lots of salt with none of the junk. No sugar, no colors, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. It contains an electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Element can help prevent and eliminate headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, brain fog, sleeplessness, and other common symptoms associated with electrolyte deficiency. Right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. Get yours at drinkelement.com. This deal is only available through the Table Talk link. You're looking to boost recovery, enhance your sex drive, and improve performance in the gym. Do you think your hormones are out of whack and you're tired of getting the runaround from your doctor? Things like your hormones are just fine, stop lifting heavy weights, etc., etc., etc. I know what that feels like, as I've been down that road most of my life. This is why we've partnered with Merrick Health. Merrick Health is a premium telehealth platform that specializes in hormone optimization and preventative medicine, ensuring a better quality of life. Merrick Health offers a Table Talk panel tailored for our listeners, featuring comprehensive tests like total and free testosterone, sensitive estradiol, and advanced markers like lipoprotein A and IGF-1. These comprehensive panels of up to 84 carefully selected biomarkers allow you to identify areas of enhancement and maximize your physical, cognitive, and sexual performance. It's much different than the panels you may get from your doctor. Choose between self-service options where you can select lab panels based upon decades of experience, or opt for guided optimization with your own health coach. Start with a detailed breakdown of your labs and receive personalized treatment options, both over the counter and prescription. Visit merrickhealth.com/tabletalk and use the code TABLETALK to get 10% off your first order. Merrick Health isn't just about better health, it's about empowering you to take control of your well-being.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Are we done selling this? I'm done. All right. Guys, this is the new elitefts.com box squat box. It weighs 73 pounds, I'm told.
It weighs 3 pounds.
You've got your story, I've got mine. He says 3, I say 73. This is absolutely amazing, guys, no joke. You can box squat on this. I'm gonna box squat it tomorrow. This sucker is strong, ridiculously strong, and it is light, guys, no joke. You can carry this anywhere, put this in your gym. Anybody can use this. It's extremely affordable as well. I really can't believe it. So I'm sure they're gonna tell you all the details down below or the side or somewhere, but this thing is absolutely amazing. 73 pounds, guys, 73 pounds.
So I occasionally have people do correctives if I feel it's necessary, but it's the bare minimum. Because
Well, where should that fall? Because I can see this two different ways. Like if it's done before a main lift and it's, rotator cuff injury, whatever it is, but then you are fatiguing that so it can't stabilize as effectively during that main lift.
Right.
Did you just not create a bigger issue? Right. So and obviously intensity is going to be a big role here. Like, is it just the warm up or is it not? Is it restoring range of motion or is it fatiguing? And there's nuance. There's definitely nuance.
Absolutely.
But most people aren't going to have that. It's like, I was told to do 5 sets of 10 of this, and now it's completely fatigued, and now your ability to stabilize just kind of went to shit. Now, on the other end of that, if it's done way too late, then everything else is so fatigued that are you even able to activate that at all because it's the issue area. So the question is on the nuance, and how to approach that.
I'm trying to think of how to answer that. I think the long and short of that is that I'm going to come back to kind of what I was saying, that the rest of the session itself should bring up that very deficit. Yeah. And I don't mean that from like the form of corrective. Like, I still think that there's a misunderstanding in terms of like, what's something you would do for a rotator cuff, just so we can talk about that example.
Me personally, something that's probably more isometric in nature.
Okay. Or something that you would give to someone.
Mm-hmm. Actually mean nothing, because the bench should actually take care of that. But let's just, for sake of conversation, internal, external rotation.
Okay. So you'd give someone like a banded IR.
Well, it's pretty much what everybody's going to tell them to do. So that's why I'm going with that, because that's what they would be told to do, which is...
Is it really still that bad out there?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I see, I guess what I'm exposed to is way better, but...
Yeah.
Okay, so if we think about the function of the rotator cuff and the function of the shoulder, right? So the rotator cuff is actually designed to help kind of stabilize that ball in the socket, not like do this, right? It actually provides a little bit of decompression so that we can move. Because if that thing just gets sucked up in there, that's one of the big misconceptions too. So people are like, oh, people just pulls it into the socket. Like, no, there's like synovial fluid and there's stuff that's happening. There's actually an electrochemical gradient within the joint that helps suspend bones. Don't touch. They shouldn't. Unless there's like a severe OA going on, osteoarthritis. So if we're thinking rotator cuff, right? Part of what that does is give a little bit of distraction to the joint. What else is going to work with that area? Well, we're going to look at something like a delt, rear delt. What's something that's going to overpower that? Traps get really overdominant, right? So we're going to look at the system and basically tailor the system to not only build in movements that are going to, I don't want to say isolate the area, but something like, gosh, just as example, if I wanted to, we could do something like a delt tricep, where someone's doing maybe a lateral raise and then a lateral partial with an iso. So it's not super heavy, right? Because we don't want to just yank on supraspinatus, and then your spider crawls. Now that sounds a lot like bodybuilding, but you go through 3 rounds of that with 30 seconds rest. You're going to build a lot of durability and a lot of endurance in the shoulder. And that endurance is going to be a big part of what's ultimately going to drive some stability as well. Does that kind of make sense? So it's not necessarily that like the session should be corrective in and of itself if it's addressed from the standpoint of looking at the function of whatever the lagging part is.
Yeah. What are some of the other ones that you see?
Oh gosh,
I guess we can just default to low back because that's going to be the number one.
So low back, I work with a lot of people who maybe are no longer powerlifting anymore. They used to. And now they want to just be really strong and train without pain, and they're okay if they don't low bar back squat anymore. So obviously the first thing I look at is hip mobility, right? I'm going to look at their bracing strategy and function. So, gosh.
That's a big one, because I know a lot of lifters that fit that category that you're speaking about.
Yeah.
And from my observation of a limited demographic sample, so obviously we're not talking.
I don't know. I think you've got a better demographic than
is when they stop squatting is when their back becomes more of the issue. And my theory behind that is because when they squat, they're used to bracing. And then when they quit squatting, everything else they don't do anything to keep that brace strong and used, to where on the other side of that, I know a lot of people that will have lower back problems. And as soon as they can start squatting again, it goes away. And it's not squatting per se. It's what you were kind of referencing, is that ability to brace. And they're not connecting the dots with that.
What's interesting is, so first, in the example that you gave, we don't know the pain generator.
Yes.
And if we don't know the pain generator, so we just took something like back pain, which is already like Pandora's box, right? There are 25 different kinds of back pain. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make, is assuming that all pain is the same. And again, I want to come back to what we talked about at the very beginning. There are so many different types of pain. And anyway, so we don't know the pain generator. And that's going to be one of the things that will probably be one of the predictive variables when it comes to, is getting back to the squat going to be something that, feels better or feels worse. One big issue I see with people a lot is actually over bracing, where instead of having that fine-tuned motor control, they walk around 100% braced all the freaking time. Or they only know how to brace with everything they got. And they're doing it incorrectly. And so you get these layers. Gosh, I have this app I use when I'm filming limbs for people, where I can like zoom in and out and like peel muscles off. I wish I had that with me right now, because you can see how much these muscles, when they get overactive, drive so much overactivity of everything else. And the more locked in you are, if you're overly locked in, you can't move if you're too locked in. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like at its very base principle.
Yeah.
And people kind of forget that. So one of the things that I look at with someone like that is actually, can you get a little bit of fine-tuned motor control? Because if you brace everything and then try to squat, split squat, good luck. Really. So back pain is really interesting in that regard. And this is probably like the most multifaceted example that we could go through. So I'm struggling to like nail that down, but for someone like that, of course I'm going to look at fine-tuned motor control, exposure to a pattern. Like if they want to be strong still, I'm going to find ways, knowing their history. Again, most powerlifters are overly compressed and they can't expand the back half of them. So I need to find a way that's going to both cater to that and let them access that pattern, because that served them well, but also open that up. Some of that might come at the end of the session, right? So I might have them do something that's really, really compressive, like a hack squat against bands, followed by, leg press. Maybe they got a muscle round or cluster set or something like that, followed by something that's going to force them to shift the rib cage back. I don't know many people that are doing like a Zercher hold split squat. Those suckers are tough. That's really going to challenge the system and create some expansion, provided that you can get in position without using all the muscles that you're biased towards, which is something that's unique in our sports. Even I think last time I was here with Justin, he went to go row, and the first thing he did when he went to row was he tightened his pec when he grabbed the weight. Now, by all intents and purposes, if he's moving here, he should feel his back, right? But if he grabs the weight with his pec, what's he going to feel? His pec and front delt. And we have a lot of those same issues. And I think that's probably one of the greatest obstacles that people have when they try to go on social media and find an exercise, is that they're looking at someone who doesn't have our training history and our inherent neurological bias and trying to move the way they do. Someone who's never had a heavy bench, who's never held a heavy squat, is going to move a lot more fluidly. It's a lot easier for them to get in position the way textbook says they should get into position. So part of what I work on with these people is actually kind of recalibrating that. And the best way to do that, if I were going to find one thing for people, is finding a way to shift your center of mass back. Like if there's one nugget, that would be a big one. Back body expansion, to be able to shift.
Now, when you say shift your body back, the examples. Because I can hear that and I can think, okay, that's a good morning. I'm shifting my hips back, but it's actually shifting them forward. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So to just deconstruct that for people, you're shifting your hips back, but you're doing it in a pattern with such a heavy arch in your lower back, in your rib cage, kind of being shoved forward that if you, if you were if you were stood up, he'd basically be shoved forward.
Yes.
So one of the things that you can look at for reflection of center mass is looking at the rib cage, and like looking from the side at what's going on from the head to the shoulders, the hips to the feet. Rib cage elevation is one of the big KPIs for that. And almost everyone who's listening to this podcast is either going to have a lot of rib cage elevation forward, or it's going to be really depressed, because those are the two primary mechanisms from which we're going to change as we carry more weight. So when it comes to shifting center of mass, it's so much easier to demonstrate, to talk about. It's very subtle. And you could think about shifting your weight to the back of your foot, but chances are you're still hanging on to that bias that keeps you forward. So the first thing I would have someone do is literally close their eyes and soften. Because if you can soften, then you can shift. If you're not softened, you're probably extended. Really hard to shift back when all your extensors run literally from your pelvis to the top of your rib cage into your skull, shove you forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that kind of hit on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, the reason I was asking is because if the rib cage, as you're speaking about, is, and lifting of the rib cage is where people are going to get confused with all that, right? Because they're going to think just breathing more, is going to lift that rib cage.
Oh boy.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And can we just talk about the rib cage for a minute? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. We think about the rib cage as one unit, and there are changes that happen. Again, I want to kind of think about that water balloon. I talked about that with like core values earlier, right? But you could think about that as the area between your rib cage and your pelvis, but you can also kind of think about that as your rib cage. If you squeeze that one direction, it's going to change the shape of the other, because those ribs start at the back and they wrap all the way around, and they're pretty pliable. There's more movement that happens in this area than people think about. The two biggest ways that I see people kind of adapt to training, there are two very big, two big ends of the pendulum here. So most people are going to fall somewhere in between, but if you're a listener, these are two kind of references that you can look at. This top portion can become depressed and come down. If you're someone who's very like upper ab dominant, like if you do a plank and all you feel are your upper abs, this is probably you. You're going to want to look at kind of learning to expand this portion without your neck just going. If you're someone who gets really, really atrocious headaches after things like deadlifts and squats, that's probably you. The other end of that pendulum is going to be someone who's so flattened at the back that they're so shoved forward. And those lower ribs are out, right? So this is going to also kind of relate to this whole like infrasternal angle bias stuff. And I don't want to get too far down that. But again, as a listener, you're probably going to have a better idea on if you're someone who's really, really depressed here and everyone's got a rib flare, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Of course, if you want to fix it, there are ways to do that, but you're not like broken if you have one. There's a reason for it. But those are the two kind of bookends that I see. So when it comes to talking about the rib cage, I really, really hope people can appreciate what an enormous influence it has, not only from the standpoint of like, we think about bracing, right? We immediately think about getting under a bar or holding a bar. There's a lot of other stuff that happens as a result of what's happening in the rib cage. If we can't expand posteriorly, it's really hard for our diaphragm to function the way that it needs to. And that diaphragm obviously is part of the core of the brace. If that rib cage stays forward because it can't expand, it's going to have an enormous influence on how we go about life. So if you're listening to this right now, literally take your shoulder blades, squeeze them together as much as possible, and shove your chest forward. Feel what happens to your lower back and hips, and then try to walk around. That's a very gross representation of what happens when people lose posterior expansion. And there's a series of nerves. It's a sympathetic ganglion, kind of sits right in that left side, especially, that can have a huge influence on our sympathetic, parasympathetic, and how we feel during the day, secondary to mechanical influences on the rib cage. So when we think about the rib cage as a mechanical influence from the diaphragm, obviously it's going to change your core function because our obliques and transverse abs run right there. But there's also kind of this not central, but there's more of this nervous system component with regards to autonomics. And that our autonomics, you want to talk about performance, that's everything. I mean, you know that too. Like, so rib cage, I could talk about the rib cage a lot. Sorry.
Yeah. Were there any topics that you had down there that you wanted to cover I didn't bring up?
You know, just kind of from the heart more than anything, it still kind of shocks me to hear how bad the state of rehab and things like that is. And it's not going to get any better until we as coaches and we as athletes, and again, this is coming from someone who, like, I'm a coach, I'm an athlete in bodybuilding at the highest level, I'm an athlete in powerlifting at a very, very high level. I'm in the medical field. Like, this is coming from someone who has all the hats on, and all of what I've learned in the entire way that I treat now is based on having kind of thrown myself into training and broken myself in a way, and, you know, kind of like put it back together. And it's not going to get any better until we can learn to think differently. We absolutely need to have a new paradigm, and we absolutely need to start seeing through a different lens. It's almost like if you go to the eye doctor and they like tell you, like, okay, better or worse. Just because something doesn't work right now doesn't mean it won't always work. And I really hope that people know that they're their biggest asset in creating change for themselves. It honestly kind of breaks my heart when I talk to someone who has been all over social media and been kind of fed a certain narrative, because those narratives, to some degree, like, yeah, there's some good evidence-based stuff out there and like things we know about, like back pain, pain management, nerve damage, things like that. Like, that's all information, right? But information is not a system. Information gives us data points. And for us, the longer we've trained, especially, the more outside the bell curve of normal that we are, the bigger grain of salt we need to take all the advice in terms of like how to fix things with. We're going to be different. We have so many different layers of stuff that's come up. So I just want people to have hope that just because you try something on social media doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you're lost. Quite frankly, it probably means that your body has served an incredible purpose for you, and it's adapted really well for you, and you just need a different lens and a different solution. There are so many providers that want to help with that. So many. So
the question I would have with that is, in physical therapy and now in other fields as well, we're seeing two paths. You know, there's the insurance path and then the not insurance path. And it seems to me, in my opinion, the insurance path is trapped, broken, and what's screwing a lot of people up, right? Where the private pay path, or is where you're going to find people that are more open-minded, that are basically thinking the way that you're thinking. The shitty part is if you can't afford it, well, then you're kind of stuck, you know, in this other path, you know, to where, and I'm not going to sit there and say everybody in that insurance paid path is like that, but I'm pretty comfortable in saying the majority probably are, because a limit on sessions and, you know, all this other kind of crap that kind of goes along with that, where I think what you're talking about when you're looking at social media and stuff like that is people are seeing that, and it's like, I don't want to go this path because they've been told that's all bullshit or whatever it's going to be. And that may or may not be true. Most of the time, in my opinion, it probably is true. But they won't have the financial resources to be able to go private pay to be able to do that. So when I'm approached with somebody in that situation, the way that I address that is it's going to be cheaper in the long run. right? Even if it is insurance covered, because the odds that it's going to become better over a period of time is not the case. It almost seems as though they don't want it to become better. So, more money can be milked through the system. Where once you look at what that cost will be over 10 years, leading probably to surgery or whatever it's going to be way higher than if they went the other route.
Yeah.
Are you seeing the same type of thing? And I don't think this, to put this out here, I don't think this is a political issue. I just think it's the system that was established a long time ago and how that system works. And I don't want to blame people that work in that system, because that's the system they have to work within.
Right. I mean, I really feel for, I worked in a clinic like that for a long time. I was very lucky in that I worked with people who were phenomenal thinkers. Like everything about, I didn't want to go to PT school because I thought it was a load of crock, and everything about the way that I think right now, I could pivot right back to a decision that I left a job that was making me good money, and I went to work for like $7 an hour and drive 1 hour one way to work at this clinic because they were that great. The tough thing is that I think that people see fewer options than there actually are. I think the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater a lot. And what I mean by that is that people will look at PT and go, well, it's either, go to this insurance-based clinic where they're not going to view me as an athlete, or I go to this cash pay clinic where I don't know that I can afford to go consistently. And when you're left with only those two options, I agree. I think going to see someone who's out, outside of the insurance network, there's a lot more freedom and flexibility with that. I think the bigger component to that is generally those people are personality wise, they're less risk averse. And so they're more, it's kind of like people who go out into the world and learn and like really experience rather than sit back and wait for stuff. Right. So I think in general, those are probably better clinicians, not only from you're going to get better care because you're not with insurance, but I think those are generally more forward thinking people. But I think what happens is instead of either one of those, people go, I don't really like either one of those options, so I'm going to create a third option for myself. And that is that I'm going to go and watch an influencer personal trainer on Instagram who says they have a rehab specialty.
That's why I think we're seeing what we're seeing.
And again, that's kind of where I just want to say, if those are the three options that you're seeing, it's always a valid question to ask, is there another option? Always, in almost any circumstance, right? And so if none of those really seems like it's getting you where you need to be, is there another option? And there's so much great information out there. And honestly, there are so many providers, there are so many people like me out there now. I don't want to say we're not hard to find. It's just most of us, if you want to do a 1 hour consult, right? Let's say, gosh, I've got a lot of therapy friends that I would be super confident referring people to. They could do a 1 hour consult, do some assessment, say, hey, here's what I want you to work on for the next 4 weeks. That way you're not going to that in-person provider once or twice a week, once a week, every other week, if they're really good, which is what I would hope for. You're not getting the hands-on provided treatment. You're not getting any of the manual work, things like that. And there's a lot of value in that. There's so much value in that. Even just touch in and of itself has a lot of downstream and upstream effects, biomechanical transduction, a whole bunch of other things. But if those are the options, you always got to ask yourself, again, there's an exchange, right? You can make the exchange of seeing someone in person and there's a financial exchange there, but you also get some of the hands-on work, someone who's going to be able to probably get a really good feel for where you're at. If you're working with someone remotely, you're probably going to get a little bit better of financial exchange and still get that forward-thinking clinician who's not, stuck seeing 40 patients a day. And I think it just really depends on what people are comfortable with. And the fact of the matter is, whoever you see, if they're a good clinician, they're going to want to see you succeed and improve. So I think to kind of summarize all of that for people, ask yourself, is there another option? Before your gut says, no, there's not. There probably is. And
yeah. Well, there is. And there's also, you can create your own hybrid.
Yes.
So you go X place first, and then now you have better data to give if a consultant like yourself.
Yeah, I love when I get that.
Right.
That's my favorite.
And now a lot of the guesswork is kind of being taken out, assuming that first diagnosis was correct. But at least it's going to put you in the right ballpark, to be able to look. And that's what I think people also miss as well, is they'll go get diagnosed and then not like it and then just drop it. And it's like, well, I don't want to keep doing this. This is all stupid, but there's still data there.
To some extent. I think people really hang on a diagnosis either too much or not enough, depending on who they are, right? Like they're, in general, if I had to pick a camp, I'm not huge on diagnosis. However, there are situations where it's really important. If someone's got a multi-level disc extrusion, that's different,
Oh yeah, I mean,
if someone's those things are important. But I think what happens is, more often than not, people will go and they'll have a lot of pain. That pain will, either be chronic, or it'll be the kind of thing where they woke up with one day and it just got worse. They go in to see a doc, and the doc says, I can't find anything. I don't know what to tell you. And so they feel dismissed. And when you feel dismissed, I don't know anyone that likes to feel that way. My first response when I feel dismissed is, I don't know. Leave me in a lot of confusion. And so I think that's where it's important for people to hear that the diagnosis isn't everything. There are a lot of incidental findings. We don't see a huge correlation between things we see on an image and pain.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, because a acquaintance of mine went and saw a practitioner. I don't want to say what type of practitioner, because I don't want to, make any profession look bad.
Okay.
And, was told, this is the worst stenosis I've ever seen in my life. You should basically never lift heavy.
Don't
again.
breathe the wrong way.
And then, a year and a half, 2 years later, gets an MRI or whatever done. Somebody else looks at it and says, no, this is absolutely normal, for somebody your age. But for a 2-year period of time, was living under this impression that I can't do all these different things, because if I do this and it gets any worse, I'm going to be in a wheelchair, because that's what somebody else told them. So there's value in having, multiple opinions, obviously. And there's values in getting outside of just one type of practice.
Absolutely.
Because each practice is going to inherently have its own bias.
Absolutely.
And when you look outside that bias, as long as it's not so holistic, it's actually stupid.
Yeah.
So because that's another one too. But there's value in that. How would somebody, with all this in mind, how would somebody go about contacting you?
They can find me on Instagram, or they can email me, and my email's right in the midst of change. I think when this is released, my email will be different. But
your Instagram has a link tree that has
correct
intake and everything else on there.
My Instagram is Dani LaMartina, DPT. And if I can't help people, I'm not the right fit for everyone. And I know that. There are people I've said, I'm going to spend an hour and a half with them in a consult, kind of go, hey, I don't think we're the right fit. I can't serve you the way that you need to be, but I know this person that can. And it's really important, I think, again, always to know there's another option. Always.
Any final thoughts?
Thank you. Thanks for believing in me over the years. It was crazy driving here today. I was like, man, Dave's literally known me almost 10 years now. I think it has been 10 years. And, showing up to the first powerlifting experience where I got to meet you and the rest of the gang was wild. So it's cool.
That was before education, before you just powerlifting.
No, I was in.
I mean, the education was there, but before the doctorate, yeah.
Yeah, no, I had just graduated.
Okay.
Yeah. It's funny to me. I see some coaches and PTs out there now. They're like, yeah, in the 2 years I've been helping people. And I'm like, that's great. That's a good start. I've got another 15 years before I feel like I can confidently say, and I started working at PT clinic. I was 16. I'm 36 now. So that's 20 years that I've been around this.
So what part about all this, because after knowing you for this long, you're always looking to become better and more educated. So, when we were talking about passion or whatever it was before, this is your greatest passion.
My whole heart, honestly, if I'm just going to be super feelsy for a minute, again, like I fucking love heavy training. Like it's my thing. I would not go, like, I don't want life without this. My whole heart in this, I tend to kind of collect people who've either had a really bad experience with other coaches, other clinicians, or for one reason or another, just can't even see past where they are right now to see, like, just have a glimmer of hope to see what's next. Whether it's they can't pick up their kid, or they've had like catastrophic injury, or there's this belief system around who they are as people. And I believe there's an enormous connection between our heart and our body. And when our body hurts, or when we feel trapped in something that feels like there's a disability, it changes so much of how we interact with people. It changes everything about us, and it can be a huge trajectory changer. I kind of feel like the things that I've lived between the injuries and the medical diagnosis and like all the weird stuff, and I've downplayed a lot of it here, like the severity of it. If there's anything that I can do, I just want people to know that, like, I'm in it with them, and I always want to bring them hope. I want to bring them peace. I'm not going to sugarcoat shit. If someone's got a long road, I'm going to tell them, but I promise I will do everything I can to align with them, to see them, and to move them forward. And I can only do that by living in it in the trenches. I can only know how to help people like us who've trained this heavy this long, because I've been training this heavy this long as a PT, right? So my passion is always to find a way to serve people, to allow them to live fully.
Yeah, but see, years ago, you could have just stopped your education and been able to serve the majority of people. But something's driving you to continue to learn more.
I guess I hadn't even considered that. There's always
Well,
more.
a lot do. If it's in that medical profession, they'll get to a certain point and then they stop learning entirely. Maybe the only thing they'll learn is when they go to I call it a golf conference, because, the conference.
Because they go to Maui and they,
yeah. And they don't even go to lectures or anything like that.
I think the thing for me is I've always felt like I needed a me for me, and I couldn't find it. And even right now, like, this is going to sound really, really egotistical and really arrogant, but I've always felt like I'm just a little bit ahead of where the current trends are. So like I did the PRI stuff with Casey back in 2015. I got a lot of backlash for that. People are like, why in the world are you looking at his breathing and his diaphragm? And now what's all anyone talk about? Breathing, diaphragm, rib cage. But I found that because I needed it. And not to say it's the only solution, but I've always needed a me for me. And I think now what we're seeing more and more with the research is there's such an integration between what we can express here and what's going on physiologically in here. So that's kind of where I started looking more at like the biochemical components, and where I really want to go is to have a much better understanding of truly what's happening on the physiological biochemical level in someone like us. And so even looking at all this like infrasternal angle stuff, I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, for someone whose rib cage is depressed, that means they're constantly exhaled. And we're going to have them do more exhalation-based exercises to sympathetically regulate them. What if we got them inhaling first? So I think my passion has always just been, I needed someone to solve the problems that I had. And I look at, the people who use this as the thing that grows them the most, is maybe not the most, but close to it as people. And I want to give them that back. So I always want to be just a little bit ahead. And you only get that way by living it. And the people that sit here and talk about like, they're doing their first show, so they're in the trenches. They are, but it's different than, like what I have put myself through in the last 10 years. I look back at and I'm like, holy cow, sis. Like, it's okay for you to take a break for a minute. It's okay. Even just if I were to watch myself train and what I trained through and chose to keep going through, I don't know how to articulate how hard those last 8 weeks of Olympia prep were. I will never doubt my mental resilience ever again. I don't know how I functioned. I really don't. So yeah, I think I love this. I throw myself into it, and I need someone to solve the problems. And while there are a lot of people who are great at rehab, and there are a lot of great training coaches, there are very few people who can really appreciate both sides, from both the biomechanical as well as the physiological sides. And they're so interrelated. So I feel like, out of service to myself and out of obligation to myself, I need to go figure that out.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank you for coming out. It's been great. Guys, thanks for listening, and we're done. All right, guys. Thanks for watching the video to the end. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and click here, 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 or here for more videos.